Perfect. Okay,
All right.
so Dr. Vitale, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Sure, no problem.
A couple of things I wanted to say just straight off the bat was I know we're dealing with a time difference, so you were so accommodating to do this morning. And the second thing was just how much of an honour it is to have you on the podcast. I'm really so chuffed that you agreed to come on.
Sure. Yep. No problem. It's my pleasure. And
brilliant.
I just look at it. First of all, I enjoy doing these things. I get a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of them, and I also view it as my responsibility. So I'm very happy to do it, and I'm honored to be on your show. So with that being said, I'm here to try to give whatever information I can with you and your audience. Yep. Not a problem.
Thank you. Okay, there's so much to cover.
Yeah.
The first thing I would like to do is just before we actually get on to talking about this wonderful art that we do, if we can just spend a few moments talking about yourself, and if you can give us a little introduction to how you started in Taekwondo and just your own experiences in the martial arts, that would be brilliant.
Sure. So back in the 1970s, the Eastern fighting arts started coming to the West really in the very slowly in the 60s. And towards the late 60s, they started catching on, and they really accelerated in the early 70s. And that's when I noticed it. Growing up in America, and as I'm sure all around the world, young boys learn to do some fighting or boxing with their father. And, I remember my father saying, keep your dukes up, and, he would show me just hitting his open hands and whatnot. And then he would try to hit at me and I'd have to duck and whatnot. And I had gotten involved in some organized boxing on a very crude level on my local block association when I was a kid. And then in high school, wrestling was very popular. And I didn't join the team, but as part of the gymnasium of physical education, wrestling was one of the topic in sports that we would cover. Yep. So I very much enjoyed that. And then my older brother was doing some Korean karate, what they called Tang Soo-do in those days. Mm-hmm. And he would show me a couple of the basic, punching things and, the basic front kick, I guess anybody can do. And my father would say, don't kick, when you fight, you couldn't kick because that was fighting like a girl. So it was kind of like a dichotomy there. And the boxing from the West and the martial arts, traditional Eastern martial arts from the East were coming into a mix. So with that as the backdrop, all of a sudden there was a series of movies, the Billy Jack movies. It started with Born Loser, then Billy Jack, The Trial of Billy Jack, and then Billy Jack Goes to Washington, which was actually hysterical. And when I watch these movies today, I can't believe they impacted me so much.
Yeah.
I was so impressionable, and it was a very different time. The war in Vietnam was raging. There was a lot of discontent in the United States, and the movies had a profound impact on me. And I was coming home on the subway from high school one day. Our subway would be like your underground. One of my best friends who I went from grammar school to high school together with, Eduardo Rodriguez, he said to me, what did I do this week? And I said, I saw this really great movie, Billy Jack. I wish I could do what he did. And he goes, why don't you train? And I said, I wouldn't know the first place to start. So he said, why don't you go where I go? And it was 2 blocks from my house. And I had stopped up there once or twice, to take a peek in and watch what was going on. And I seen some amazing feats there. Like I had no idea a person could run, jump into the air, and turn their hips like parallel to the floor and hit a heavy bag with 2 feet. Like a 20-foot flying sidekick, and hit with those 2 feet simultaneously and rock that bag that the building seemed to shake. I didn't think it was possible. Just like I didn't think there was a Superman, even though I used to see him fly out the windows and stuff. I said, there's got to be some kind of gimmick with this. And of course, there wasn't. There was no cameras. It was not a Hollywood set. He was just a guy. His name was Ruben Lopez, just running down, taking off, flying into the air. There was no strings or cables that were doing it. And I said, wow, that was really impressive. So Eduardo got me to join that day, and come up to the school and join. And when I joined, the teacher told him to bring me in the back to put my uniform on, my dobok. So when we were taken out from the package and he was taken out of his bag, I saw his black belt and the top with the black trim on it. I said, wow, you're a black belt? He goes, yeah, what do you think? And, he had giant knuckles on his right fist.
Yeah.
And we used to say, Ed, how come you have such big knuckles? And he used to say, I'm nervous. And when I'm nervous, I chew on my knuckles. That's how he had the cover story. Because in those days, nobody said they would going for martial arts. They would get teased and maybe challenged and whatnot. So like I said, it was new to the West and it had this mystique. So we believed him because he had a very, very bad stuttering problem. He stammered a lot. And when we were in grammar school, kids are vicious. We'd sit in the class and, you would go first, read the first paragraph, then me, and everybody would wait till Eduardo went because it was just so difficult for him. So we, it just made sense and we believed it. But of course, the enlarged knuckles was from the constant conditioning. So when I joined, I never looked back. I was 16 years old in high school. It was back in the early 70s. And I connected with my teacher, who was a seventh degree master with the ITF, Kim Kwang Sung. He was his certificate number was K745. So that means he was the 45th person because there were no other masters at that time. They were all Koreans. So he was the 45th person in the world to earn seventh degree, which was master. And I had no idea about General Choi and nothing. I just knew my teacher was like a god because of how physically talented he was. And he was, me and him formed a very close bond. And at that time, relationship with my father was very difficult because I was your typical teenager coming into their own, strutting my stuff, wanting my independence. And, mom and dads don't know anything at that age, Later on, you start to realize, wow, look how smart my mother and father got. No, they didn't get smarter. You just realized they were right all along. So this was I was going through. And he really he was not just a coach. He wasn't an instructor. He was a teacher and he taught me about life. He became like a second father figure to me. We became very close. He saw in me something special. He saw in me a talent, a love for learning, and a desire and ability to communicate that to others. So, I was never blessed with any physical talent, none whatsoever. And for somebody that's been involved in such a physical activity for decades, we're talking almost 50 years.
Yeah, yes.
How do you survive in a physical activity like that if you are not superior with your physical skills? Because I bet almost everybody you interview, they are these notable figures, but for the most part, almost every single one of them has really great God-given natural physical talent. And that was not my case. It's still not my case. When I teach, I'll have to do like General Choi did. I'd have to bring up people to demonstrate, because if I demonstrated, people would quit, first of all, and they really wouldn't learn anything. So, I'm more of a hands-on person, explaining, getting them to think how something works and whatnot. So he saw this, and because of our bond and because of what he saw in me, he was able to develop that. And when I started traveling, it was mostly around bringing, I competed as a color belt, but I was never good enough to win. And I figured when I got my black belt, there's no way I'm competing, because I would not get hurt. I'd get killed. I would get demolished. So, it's easy to compete against other yellow belts, green belts, and blue belts. But even red belt level, I could tell this was getting serious. So I wanted nothing to do with the sparring as on the black belt level. So everything was very local. And as we were very good at competing in the tournaments, my teacher would identify tournaments in a larger and larger radius, but they were all tournaments run by Koreans, his friends. He wanted to support them, and we never went to open tournaments. It was very, very it was a very, very closed type of thing. And so it was just really on a local and a little bit of a regional level. And then at some point, my teacher had to leave the ITF because of the whole communist stigma.
Yep,
And
yep.
he received so much pressure from the KCIA. His brother back home in Korea had a government job and would call him almost every week and say, brother, who's this guy, Mr. Choi? You have to leave him. I'm going to lose my job. So especially once General Choi went to North Korea in 1981, it really became very difficult for any Korean living abroad because, they had to have their passports renewed. They wouldn't be allowed to go home and visit their family. Their family back home would suffer. What people have to understand, South Korea in those days is not the thriving, rich democracy. It's a vibrant democracy today. It was under the control of a series of very brutal dictators. 3 military generals ran Korea from 1961, when it was a coup, until the late 1990s, when they started transitioning. And the first democratically elected civilian leader of South Korea didn't happen until the early 90s. I don't know if it was 92 and 93. So you're talking a very difficult period of time. And in South Korea, remember, South Korea is physically adjoined to what we call North Korea. And they were under constant threat of another outbreak of an all-out civil war. And actually the civil war that ended in 1953 never technically ended because there was never any peace treaty. They just signed a ceasefire agreement, an armistice. We're not going to fight anymore. And it's never been resolved. And there have been different points along history where traumatic things would happen in South Korea. And they would gear up because, the North's going to take advantage of this and the communists are going to come down. So this was a turbulent time. And when that was occurring, my teacher finally had to break his ties, sever those ties with General Choi and the ITF. So other things were happening in my Taekwondo life, where I was meeting other people in other schools that weren't they weren't ITF, they weren't WTF, they were independent, they were American students with an American instructor. Everything I was very Korean centered because my teacher's whole network was the fellow pioneers and Koreans who emigrated from the United States. And this is one of the ways they supported each other. It's like buying in-house, let's support each other. So when I started branching out, I met a couple of people that were looking to attach to a federation. So I told them about the ITF, and I told them we couldn't be part of it because my teacher had to leave because of politics. But since they were American, it was no problem. So in my attempt to help make a connection with them, that's when I made the connection directly to the ITF. And eventually that would cause me a lot of problems with my teacher. We had a big falling out. It took 19 years to reconcile, but thank God we did reconcile. And I'm proud and thrilled that I have that presence again in my life. And it's funny because nowadays he's so proud of me because of all that I've accomplished, because obviously that reflects highly upon him. But truly, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be doing this interview today, because he never gave up on me. He nurtured, he saw, he discovered, he saw something in me, and he nurtured that and developed it and allowed me to do all the things that I did. And I remember we'd go out to dinner and he'd tell the other black belts, they used to tease me and call me Chicken George, because Chicken George was from that series on slavery in America, Roots. And it was one of the nicknames for the character there. And he said, no more Chicken George. Now Professor George, because he used to tell me Hillary Clinton was a Secretary of State for the United States at the time. You have to go, Clinton. You have Mrs. Clinton. You have to bring my country together, So, Koreans really would love peace on their peninsula. So really, everything that I've accomplished is all because of him. Everything I accomplish in life is all because of my parents, my academic education, and the Taekwondo training I had, and my religious instruction. They say there's everybody has a chair that they sit on, and chairs have four legs. And the four legs of my chair is, of course, my family. I was blessed to be born into a great family, by far not a perfect family, but a great family. Uh, uh, to be raised in the Catholic faith as a Christian, and to have the idea there's somebody above you watching you that demands moral behavior was very good for me growing up. And my academic education, I have 6 college degrees, including the PhD. I love learning. I love amassing knowledge, and it gives me a great satisfaction to share that knowledge. And then, of course, there's the Taekwondo, because the Taekwondo training supplemented the 3 things, the 3 other legs. My family, or my religion, my academic education. So there's no question that the discipline that I was exposed to, and the second fatherly figure as my instructor, and then all the great instructors that I've met over the years, starting with Grandmaster Seraph in the United States, General Choi himself, the late Master Park Jung Tae. I mean, there are so many people. I've met them all. I've become so close to Colonel Nam Tae Hee. He was like my Taekwondo grandfather. And when I knew him and got close to him, it was when he was much older in life and it slowed down. So I would do things to help him personally, like, help him, bring him into the restroom. He'd stay in my hotel before his room was ready. I would wheel him in the wheelchair, opening, closing doors, helping him out, so we grew very close, because he saw how well I thought of him, and how respectful I was, and how I looked out for him. And my career in the martial arts, I wouldn't trade for anything. So that's how it got me here. And because of that journey, I was able to meet so many people and to glean information from them. So as I say over and over again, it's like a farmer. A farmer takes the seeds, gets the ground ready, plants the seeds, tends to the crops, make sure they're watered, all these kind of things. And then finally the harvest comes, they harvest the crops. And can you imagine if a farmer had all these crops and locked them in a barn and let them rot? That to me is not only a sin, but it would be a crime. So I've had this information shared with me. I don't want to lock it in a barn. I'm very willing to share it. I try always to remember to credit people, because remember, I dug for this information, but I didn't create it. These people actually created these scenarios in time, and they were actually there viewing it, recording it, and documenting it, and witnessing it. And I'm just taking their witness statements, so to speak. So it wasn't that I did anything. I was just blessed to be in a position to get that knowledge. But so that's my background. That's how I came into the martial arts. And I mentioned the 6 college degrees. With a master's degree and a PhD, those are research degrees. We have an associate's degree, a 2-year degree, and a bachelor's degree, 4-year degree. So I have 2 of those each, one being in history, one being in liberal studies. And but the graduate degrees in graduate school, master's and PhD, they're research degrees. So I'm a trained researcher from an academic perspective. And then my career was with the police department. I started off as a state trooper. I got promoted. I was an investigator. Then I got promoted to a senior investigator. The senior investigator is the one that runs the detective units. Like, we're in charge of whatever we're investigating, whether it be a homicide, whether it's somebody's background. So I've been fortunate enough to be extensively trained in 2 areas: criminal investigations, where interviews and interrogations are vitally crucial, and academic research. And I've combined the 2 of them. One thing that I critique, I've been in my dealings on social media, I've been more forthright and upfront, and sometimes purposely in your face to be provocative, that you simply can't speak to a high-ranking senior in the martial arts. You simply cannot speak to them in an interview if they are here and you are here. In order to do an interview, you have to be the same vantage point. Plus, you have to be very knowledgeable. So when somebody misleads you or makes a mistake or embellishes, leaves something out, you can push back to get them. And I find that too many martial arts students interview these iconic legends, and they just ask them questions, and then they take it as gospel truth. Now, I'm not saying anybody's lying, but our ability to recall is limited at best. You know this from a police standpoint. Eyewitnesses accounts are terribly unreliable because they're just not as good as physical evidence. And when I do an interview with the pioneer, I come with a treasure chest. I mean, a giant suitcase of factual data. And I've had pioneers call me up and ask me for help when they wanted to be interviewed by other people. They would call me up and ask me to come over to help them because they didn't want to get anything wrong because it's going to be in print and they don't want to mislead. So I've been cautioning people. You can be a student and then be admiring and listening to stories. Stories that people tell. But please do not equate that these stories are exactly what happened, the way they happen, and the ones involved happening. I've noticed that there are many that like to embellish. We all have that in us. There are others that have animosities towards other people, so they want to downplay them. We see this in the history of Taekwondo. General Choi was the person who started the whole Taekwondo movement and named the art. And he's written out of history for decades, not only written out of history, but he was blacklisted and subjected to terrible, vile rumors and just scandalous lies made up about him. So we know this takes place. So I urge anybody that has an opportunity and the honor to meet somebody, of course you respect them. But if you haven't done your homework first, you won't know how to push back. And there is just, Taekwondo history is so confusing and so controversial to begin with because it grew up in a very turbulent time in Korea. So you cannot expect to understand the history of Taekwondo unless you understand the context of how this history occurred. You know, the political times that it developed in, and that's key. So, you know, when I do my interviews, I come armed with things. There was another legendary Taekwondo figure that moved to the background when he left the ITF, because he left the ITF in the early 70s, had a fallout with General Choi, as many did. And he was, now you're in the UK, the father of Taekwondo in the UK is Grandmaster Ri Ki-ha. This was one of Grandmaster Ri's primary teachers, Lee Byung-moo and Kim Bak-man. People know about Kim Bak-man, but very few people know about Lee Byung-moo. Lee Byung-moo I knew personally because he was very good friends with my teacher. We would go to his tournament to support him, right? And people would call him the quiet man of Taekwondo. And I had no idea when I knew him, he was this iconic, legendary figure that was very pivotal in the early days. Remember, he is one of Grandmaster Ri's 2 instructors. So everybody in the world looks at Grandmaster Ri as this iconic figure, which he is. But I intimately know his 2 instructors. And when I talked to Grandmaster Lee Byung-moo at one of his students had an opening ceremony at the dojang, the new school they did, and afterwards there was a meal and I sat down and, you know, I was introduced, so I was an honored guest, but I was nowhere near as honorable as Grandmaster Lee. And we just I sat next to him and we're eating and he started talking to me and we talked for a very long time. And afterwards his son came up to me and he said, "What did you say to my father?" And I was taken aback because I'm very, very respectful. And I know I didn't say anything inappropriately. And I said to myself, oh my God, what did I do? Because it was not on purpose. And I'm so sorry. And before I could say, what did I do? He said, I never heard my father speak of those things in years. Wow. Then he said, and never outside the family. What did you do? And I said, geez, I don't know. I said, I just showed him I was interested. I let him know in what I was saying that I knew about the history of Taekwondo and was eager to learn more. And he just opened up like a floodgate
Yeah.
and was telling me things that shocked his son because he never spoke to them outside the family.
Yeah.
So, and some of the things he said, with all due respect to him, he didn't say not to say this to anybody, but it was a lot of it had to do with how he had the falling out with General Choi. And to this day, I've never commented on that publicly. He never asked me to, but that's not a personal thing between two people, and how they had a falling out is for those people to share. It's not, for, unless you're asked to share it. So, and I've always tried to credit people, and if somebody says this is off the record, you have to respect that. So that's how I got to where I was. And I can't imagine looking back of what I could have done differently, or even if I want to do anything differently, because even the mistakes and shortfalls I've made have, I think, contributed to making me a little bit more adept at doing, because I like to learn from my mistakes. I like to learn from the mistakes of others. So, I'm not sure I would remove mistakes, because mistakes are great learning tools, and I'm all about learning. So that's my background. I've tried to do the police and academic combination. So you can get information, because information is key. And with that, I'm just ready to go and address anything, that I can.
I think it's fair to say that the history of Taekwondo is linked directly to the modern day history of Korea and its politics. Now, the first thing I'm going to say might be a little bit naughty, a wee bit of satire attached to it. And I'm hoping that you come back and tell me straight away that I'm wrong. So, First thing, Dr. Vitale, I'm going to say to you is that Taekwondo is thousands of years old.
Well, I'm going to try not to laugh, but it's not possible. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous, and for anybody to think that, they've just fell for the myth, been fabricated on purpose by people in Korea that have an agenda. And the agenda is, quite frankly, national pride. I'm very proud of my country, but I understand my country was formed of the essence of what the UK is today. Like, people don't realize the American colonies were British colonies. And the colonists were British subjects. They were not American citizens, they were British subjects. And as British subjects, they had the rights of Englishmen that date back to the Magna Carta. So see, that's the roots of America. Yes, America is a melting pot where so many other people from around the world have come. I'm sure every country in the world is representing the United States. I am sure. But the foundation of America is really based upon the rights of Englishmen. So King George, who I'm not named after, I mean, he was our king. No different from the king, the king of the rest of the British Empire at the time. So yes, so Koreans are very proud, and you have to understand that they were subjugated, they were controlled, and they were subjugated in such a way that the Japanese occupiers, remember, the Japanese did not sail across the East Sea, not the Sea of Japan, the East Sea, and move into Korea and take it over like the European colonizers or settlers did in the Americas. Korea was a thriving country. There were native indigenous people on this continent that were thriving. And when Japanese came, they took over the Korean government as an entity and controlled it. But they not only subjugated them, they turned the Koreans into second-class Japanese citizens with really no citizenship benefits. So they suffered brutally for the whole first half of the 20th century. And then they get freed from this domination when Japan unconditionally surrendered, ending World War II. And then the foreign powers, namely the UK, United States, and Soviet Union, divided Korea. And then it was the United States and Soviet Union that couldn't come to any kind of agreement to help resettle like they did in Europe. And so Korea remains divided today. And as a result of that, there was a devastating Korean Civil War. So all of this is where the Taekwondo development takes place in. So where did Koreans learn martial arts? Same place most people in the world did, from the Japanese. The American GIs, the British soldiers, the Australians, they were in Japan learning the karate and bringing it home. I mean, that's we have to understand that's where modern martial arts began. Prior to that, it was judo. And why? Judo was a sport. Our president, Teddy Roosevelt, was a judo man. Yeah. And judo was gaining in popularity around the world, and then karate followed suit, and both those. And then someone can say, well, it was really the Chinese influence that went to Okinawa. That's all craziness. That's really just confuses the point. What the Koreans did, 7 of them learned karate from Japanese sources. 6 of those 7 learned in Japan. Another learned from a karate book, Japanese karate book. So they started teaching, and South Korea needed to perpetrate a myth. They need to make up a lie to cover the connection to Japan. Why? They hated the Japanese.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So they were doing what? They were doing karate. It was called Korean karate. So the myth that is 2,000 years old is not worth addressing because it's a lie. Yep. Now, there's what I like to do is say, yes, Korea as an indigenous people on a peninsula. Remember, peninsula defined as such because 3 sides are surrounded by water. And then that last side is mountainous region and river. So it is actually which helped Korea develop and maintain an intact culture for about 5,000 years, probably the oldest on the planet. So they're a very proud people with a very proud and long history that they take great pride in. So there's no question that Koreans had some kind of indigenous fighting arts. They had their military, they had ways to protect themselves, they had ways to defend themselves. There's no question about that. So yes, you can go back in Korean history and find traces of this. That does not mean that that is what Taekwondo was. And there is no, if you want to say that Taekyon, which really is a folk game, a martial folk game, it's really not a martial art. If you want to say Taekyon is what is Taekwondo is the modern day version of Taekyon, you then have to show that link.
Yeah.
You have to demonstrate it. Where is the evidence? And there is none. And it's funny, the Taekwondo people speak about this evidentiary link without the evidence.
Yeah.
And the Taekyon people say, that's rubbish. We have nothing to do with Taekwondo. So you wouldn't know that if you're just a Taekwondo guy reading a book saying Taekwondo's 2,000 years old. So yeah, so yes, if you go to the Taekwondo Wan today in Muju, and I suggest to people do it, is like the Disney for Taekwondo, Disneyland, Disney World. And when you go in, it's a great facility. They shaved the side of a mountain out, so it's this great facility with all kinds of houses, a very, very nice museum. And when you first move in the museum, it says that the martial arts of Korea's past. And it goes through that, which is great. And then it moves to the first wall inside where it shows where Taekwondo began. And guess where Taekwondo began? In the Korean army.
Yep.
Under the leadership of General Choi Hee. So they get it right. Yeah. And they did it in a way where, yes, see, we're proud Koreans. Look, we have this history. But in the 50s, they started developing Taekwondo. So in world history, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, which set off World War I. And then there was a very famous baseball home run that was hit that won the pennant and let his team move into the World Series. That was called the shot that was heard around the world, the baseball shot heard around the world. And of course, the pistol shot that killed the Archduke was the shot heard around I call the Taekwondo lie that Taekwondo is 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
The lie that's been spread around the world.
Yeah.
It's a great lie.
One of the things that I think that I was actually wrong in was the belief in the link between the original 5 kwans and the beginning of Taekwondo. And the more that I've read, the more I'm realizing that I actually was inaccurate there. So if we could maybe start there and clarify just how important or unimportant, perhaps, the kwans were to the beginning of Taekwondo. And then I think we can't not talk about the next part of the history without maybe branching off to General Choi's life and how that interacted as well. So,
Sure. Okay, so the 5 kwans. There were many kwans in Korea, but we call the 5 kwans the original kwans, the original 5 kwans. Now, they are very important, and they are not important at all.
okay.
Well, what are you talking about? They are very, very important because the original kwans created the people who created Taekwondo,
Right.
and the original. So that's why the original kwans are so important. The original kwans are called the original kwans because they were open prior to 1950. Remember, August 15th, 1945, Japan surrenders unconditionally, ending World War II. Korea is free. They exist for 3 years, from 45 to 48, being controlled by Soviet Union in the north and United States in the south. In 1948, they established their autonomous republics. And 2 years later, June 25th, 1950, the all-out fighting of the Korean War begins. Now, that doesn't mean the Korean War started then. If you notice, I try to choose my words very carefully. The all-out fighting. There was a lot of fighting going on between cross-border skirmishes between the two Koreas from at least 1948, if not sooner. And the South actually perpetrated more forays into the North and caused more damage. And one of the reasons being, if you look at history, again, Korean history, nothing to do with Taekwondo history. Why was this the case? Well, the North Korean military was being developed like the South Korean military, but the North Korean military was busy. You know what they were doing? They were fighting in China on the side of Mao Zedong against Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese struggle for control. So when Mao Zedong prevailed, started to pressure Stalin for permission to attack and reunite his country, and Mao Zedong owed him, so it was like payback time, and that's how it happened. So the original kwans are those 5 kwans that opened between 1945 and 1950. 1950 comes, Korea is devastated. 80%, they estimate 80% of the peninsula is destroyed. The bombing that the UN, the US-led United Nations did, primarily the United States, was devastating. It was devastating. And the amount of casualties was just terribly high. And they estimate that a war of that duration had more death and destruction and casualties than any other war in the history of mankind. It was just terrible. So from 1950 to July 27, 1953, when they had the armistice, Korea is just in an upheaval, just pure chaos. After 1953, the fighting ends with the signing of the armistice, and now life in Korea slowly starts rebuilding and trying to get back to a bit of normalcy. These 5 kwans closed during the Korean War. Why? Because everything closed. So when they reopened after 53, and as the war, different stages of the war allowed it, of the 5 kwans, only 2 kwans remained with their original instructors, doing exactly what they did before. The other 3 kwans were now led by students, and they changed the names of the kwans, and in these three kwans, there was fighting over the leadership because remember, you're the boss, right? You're gone.
Yeah.
Now, me and my fellow students are fighting over who's going to be the new boss.
Yeah.
This story, you don't have to have a Korean War. This is what happens all the time. It happens all the time. So this is what happened in Korea. So these kwans reopened and were reestablished, and new students came, new changes, new leaders, and fighting over leadership. And it was these kwans that produced the second generation students, right? The second generation was taught by the first generation. The first generation learns from Japanese sources.
Okay.
Wan Ki of Murakwan was the only one that didn't go to Japan and learn. He claims he learned some Chinese martial arts in Manchuria during the occupation period, and then learned karate from a book. And there's evidence that he collaborated with some of the Koreans that were doing their Korean karate in Korean after the off to the side with the Murakwan. And he also changes his name, but he is still doing basically what he was doing, his version of Korean karate. And the others now start producing these students, and Wan Ki was producing his students, and they now form a coalition in 1961, and they create the Korean Taekwondo Association.
Okay.
And the Korean Taekwondo Association was coalesced around new, unique revolution. It was a revolution in sports rules because the martial arts at the time was karate, and everything was the stop matches. You have a center referee, something happened, he'd say stop, and then he'd point to the corner judges and they raise their flag or point to, was it a point? And if more than if a majority of the judges saw a clean, no contact was allowed.
Yeah.
So the Koreans said, screw that, we're using boxing setup.
Okay.
Judges with score sheets, continuous fighting, right? The round is going, it's a timer is going, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever. And you can even do a knockout. So there's no contact, it's full contact, and knockouts you win by, so they're encouraged. And this is what is called Taekwondo. And that's what those guys that were in the kwans were doing. So the kwans are very important historically because they produce the leaders that would eventually make Olympic Taekwondo. It's a very, very key point. But the kwan founders themselves, except for one, who was No Bin Jik from the Songwon Kwan, he was tangentially involved in Taekwondo, both with General Choi, martial art Taekwondo, and Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo.
Okay.
He was involved tangentially in a supporting role as a senior figurehead, not much influence, but he cannot be forgotten because it's a pivotal role. His students played a pivotal role, but so to say the kwans had anything to do with Taekwondo is not accurate, and it's not only not accurate, it doesn't tell the full story. So the story is they were vitally important because they created these students who went on to do great things. These students on the military side assisted General Choi in creating the original Taekwondo, which was called military Taekwondo, which was always called Taekwondo.
Okay.
And also were the leaders of the Taekwondo movement that became Olympic Taekwondo. And the other thing that's very key to remember about the kwans helped the great lie spread around the world that Taekwondo is 2,000 years old. Because the story, how would you say, they brought to the forefront Korean martial arts again. No, they didn't. They brought to Korea karate. That's what they did. Yeah. Karate learned from Japanese sources. That's what they did. But the lie manipulates and uses the kwans to make this link back to 2,000 years ago. Yeah. And it's ridiculous because if you really read the literature that South Korea put out, starting with the Ministry of Education, they put this out The Kukiwon grabbed it, the WTF grabbed it, the Korean Taekwondo Association grabbed it, and this is what Westerners all around the world would cut. We didn't have cut and paste in those days, right? But they would cut and paste this narrative, and it's in all of the books on the Olympic Taekwondo side.
Yeah.
And what is that? What is that? If you go back and read these books, there are several pages on the history of Taekwondo. Let's say there's 7 pages. I'm just making up a number.
Yeah, of course.
In books about Korean martial arts in the past, it makes no link to Taekwondo today, none whatsoever. Yeah. And then it talks about the occupation and how martial arts are outlawed, which is a lie. Martial arts were never, ever, ever, ever outlawed in Korea. There's blatant, obvious evidence in your face to show that the 2 of the kwans opened prior to 1945. So they actually opened during the occupation. Yeah. Judo was taught quite pervasively in Korea. They were trying to develop Koreans to be athletes to fight under the Japanese flag. Yeah. Boxing was allowed. Wrestling was allowed. Archery was allowed. Koreans were one of the best in archery. Archery was allowed. Now, the myth goes martial arts are outlawed because the colonial occupiers did not want to be threatened by a strong Korean people. Dude, are you crazy? A bow and arrow is a lot more than me trying to do a flying sidekick against your head. Come on. See, when you really not just read it, but examine what's being said, examine, and then think about what's being said. It's ludicrous. So 7 pages, 5 pages to the martial arts in the past with no link. Then a general thing about these things being outlawed, and then one paragraph that they call the disorder period. 1 paragraph about when the occupation ended and the kwans opened. And then they fast forward to Taekwondo was accepted on the Olympic program, was in the Asian Games. It debuted in the Continental Championships, and then it was in the 88 Olympics as a demonstration sport, in 92 Barcelona as a demonstration sport, and then as a full medal sport in 2000, getting full recognition in 1994. That's what so it goes from thousands of years ago to 1 paragraph where they say period is they're trying to say, oh, things were chaotic because Korea was liberated and there was so much going on with and then the Korean Civil War comes. The reason they say disorder and they limit to 1 paragraph, there is nothing to write about. Yeah. The only thing you can write about is 7 Koreans learned karate from Japanese sources, 6 of them in Japan. So yeah. They don't want to write about that. They don't want to talk about that. So that's how it goes. So nobody that's listening to this podcast has to take my word. Go to any book, open it up, and you'll see that's the pattern that is out there. And so the kwans are very important because the original kwan founders are iconic figures. They did something great. They brought something to Korea, and they started making it Korean in their own way. And they started owning it. And they taught their first generation of students, who now become the second generation, that gave us the military Taekwondo that became the ITF, because they helped General Choi. So that's why the kwans are important, but it's not because they did anything in Taekwondo. There's a colleague of mine, a good friend and my senior, a Grandmaster Earl Weiss. He happens to be a lawyer by trade. So he's a smart guy, highly educated. And he taught me a long time ago over the internet in some of these postings that he would write. He said, it's no problem. If you want to say the Kwan founders are the founders of Taekwondo, why stop there? They learned karate from Japanese sources, and the karate they learn mostly is Shotokan karate from Funakoshi sensei. So by that extension, since they're doing pretty much the same thing they learned in Japan, isn't the founder of Taekwondo Funakoshi?
Yeah.
There's no question. There's no question. But what we do today is not Funakoshi's karate. So any Korean would strictly attack that premise that Funakoshi is the founder of Taekwondo because it's ridiculous. So who's the founder of Taekwondo? Nobody 2,000 years ago that can't remember the name or they can't find the name. It's a guy named General Choi Hung-hee because it's clearly established that he's the one who came up with the name. It's clearly established. And then he got the first president of Korea to authorize the name when he wrote in Chinese characters Taekwondo by his own hand and then signed it with Unam, his pen name. So this is all documented. Now, you want to say General Choi is not the founder of Olympic Taekwondo? I agree, totally. Yeah. But he's the founder of the original Taekwondo, the first Korean martial art that applied the name Taekwondo to the system of self-defense it was devising, and exclusively from 1955 until today. Yeah. The Tae guys joined together. They had the same Tangsudo or Kangsudo name that General Choi and his followers used. The same, no difference. The same roots, no difference. Just General Choi chose a path of development. Canada, United States, British colonies. Canada chose a different path of development. They still use the Queen on their money, and they have the Governor General, that whole tradition with the monarchy. We don't. We severed that. We went down a completely different path. So it's the same roots, the same beginning, but different pathways. So if you don't have to recognize General Choi as the founder of Olympic Taekwondo, because he's not. He can even be rightfully labeled as a troublemaker because he tried to stop them from getting in the Olympics. Now they portray it terribly. He wasn't trying to stop Taekwondo from getting in the Olympics. He wanted his original Taekwondo to get in the Olympics. That's a huge difference. But General Choi really had very little to do with Olympic Taekwondo. So for WTF or Olympic Taekwondo people or Kuki Taekwondo people, and maybe even independent people to say General Choi is not the founder of their Taekwondo, I can't argue against that because you have to define like I did. I defined what the original kwans are. Opened prior to 1950. The Oda Kwan is not an original kwan. It opened in 1954. Just by definition, it's not. Yeah. So General Choi is not in that. He has the same status, the same background because he learned Japanese. He learned karate in Japan. So he's on par with them as far as he's not a student that learned in those original kwans. He created his own kwan, but he created it later. So he's not an original one. So I put the Oda Kwan in with the other 5 kwans, and I labeled them the early kwans. And then there was 9 kwans, those 5 Oda Kwan and 3 more. Those 3, if you remember before, I said 3 of the kwans opened with new leaders and new names. Those 3 that were added into the 9, to the 6 to become 9, is what I talked about, the split in leadership. Yeah. One student who was on par and equal to the other student, they were considered peers, said, I'm not following you, and they went their own way. So that's how the 9 get numbered, officially retired, and formally rolled into the Kukiwan back in 1978. So if you know about the kwans, you can admire, respect, and honor those people for what they did, but you'll understand what they did, and then you'll be able to honor the second generation students who became these leaders that created Kuki Taekwondo, Olympic Taekwondo, the sport version of it that eventually became WTF Taekwondo. And on the same token, people like Nam Tae-hee and Han Cha-kyo, who were they were students in those first original kwans under the original kwan instructors. They went and they helped General Choi create the Oda Kwan and to create military Taekwondo and to create what became ITF Taekwondo. So, and it's not just those 2. There are so many others that were instrumental. And I like crediting everybody.
Yeah, of course.
You hold the door for me, I say thank you. You give your seat to me, I say thank you. You go get me a cup of tea, I say thank you, right? You have to credit. So that is my long-winded answer, and I'll do that quite often about the kwans, because they are important and they have no real direct connection. But it's because you remember what Taekwondo is a new martial art. Now of course it comes from karate roots, and people will say, well, it's still a version of karate. I can't argue about that. Why? That's perception.
Yeah. Okay.
I can argue all I want that I have a full head of hair. You're looking at me, the audience is looking at me, and they know I'm lying. But I can say I have a mustache because it's true. So is my mustache in good shape? Does it make me look good? That's all a matter of perception, right? So how much has Taekwondo today become unique on its own? And how much does it still have the Korean flavor to it? And I look at two main types of Taekwondo. The original one, which became ITF, the sport or Taekwondo, which became WTF or Olympic Taekwondo. But there are many other Taekwondos. There are many independent Taekwondos. And some of them are still doing the same Korean karate, and they cling to that. They're very prideful, very proud that they're maintaining these traditions that Grandmaster Lee Won-guk taught in the Cheongdokwan back in Korea. There's nothing wrong with that. That's very proud. But they now apply the name Taekwondo to it, even though they're still doing Japanese kata.
Yep.
But and I'm not being critical at all. It's nothing I'm saying I want to be taken as negative at all. It's not. It's a statement of what they're doing, and it's okay that they want to apply the name of Taekwondo to that. But obviously, the way they became Taekwondo today has nothing to do with Geno Choi and has nothing to do with the Taekwondo guys.
Yeah.
So how did they become Taekwondo? I don't know. You got to ask them but the two main is ITF and WTF. So today it is confusing because you have a lot of entities that refer to themselves as Taekwondo, but it's largely by name only, and that's nothing wrong with that. These were proud Koreans, and they wanted to adopt the new Korean name that was offered. There's evidence to indicate General Choi put forth the name Taekwondo as an umbrella term, and for all the kwans to use. He did expect they would follow his system. Now, his system, to be very specific, his system, I believe, in his mind at that time was, can you do Warang, Chungmu, Uji, Unam, Samil? Because those are the first five patterns. Can you do these? Why? It's named after our independence. It's named after our president. It's named after our great warriors. It's named after our great military generals. And that was a way to reinvigorate Korean pride, Korean nationalism, because remember, they suffered. This cannot be downplayed. The Koreans suffered tremendously under a brutal Japanese occupation. Thousands upon thousands of women were snatched, not turned into prostitutes. Prostitutes get paid for their service. They were snatched and placed into service as sex slaves. The Japanese Imperial Armed Force, military forces, basically would just go avail themselves. I don't know if they would give a tip, but there was no. It was there for their pleasure and their release. That is extremely degrading. I don't know if I'm not a woman. I don't know if anything that'd be more degrading to a woman. And I've met two of these women. They call them the Korean grandmas because they're very elderly now. And their stories are heart-wrenching. These were teenage girls snatched from their families. And some of them never reunited with their families. Some of them never lived. And some that were reunited with their families, they were looked upon with disdain because they were a receptacle to these Japanese soldiers. It's just, so you cannot downplay what the Empire of Japan and the Imperial Japanese forces did to Koreans. How many Korean men did they snatch and bring to Japan to work in their fields and stuff, and then eventually forcefully conscripted, forcefully put young Koreans into the military. You know, to fight. Remember, you are basically living in this controlled situation, and your oppressor is now drafting you, forcing you to fight to keep that system going. So, you know, you can't disregard the suffering, and you can't downplay it. But that was the that was the impetus. That's the motivation to make their own Korean martial art. And I also want to just add one thing in. Martial arts are martial arts. What you do and I do might be different and might have a lot of overlap. I am sure you do a front snap kick. You might call it front kick. I call it a front snap kick because in ITF Taekwondo, we're so with terminology and being very methodical and well-documented art. We have all kinds of kicking to the front. So we call it front snap kick. And every martial art has front snap kick.
Yep.
When we were kids, you grab a girl's hair, she kicked you in the shin. So even somebody who doesn't learn any kind of martial art knows front snap kick. And that's what my father said, don't kick like a girl, right? So every martial art has front snap kick. So General Choi puts front snap kick in his third pattern, Dosan. Is that a Japanese front snap kick? Or is that a Chinese front snap kick? Or is that a little girl front snap kick? I mean, a front snap kick is a front snap kick. Yeah. So it's a generic martial art move. Yes, General Choi learned these generic martial art moves in Shotokan karate, and he took these Japanese katas and took movements from them and rearranged them. Sometimes you'll see whole sequences. I transfer over from the Shotokan karate. He's applied different names to them and different applications to them, but the sequence is the same. You'll see it in Wanyo. You'll see it in Poun. You'll see it in several of them. But the WTF, what would become the WTF, it was actually the KTA at the time. Did the same thing with the Pauge forms. Did the same thing with the Taekwondo Pumse. These are basic rearranged moves. Now they can say we're still karate, and we say no, we're not. Look, we have this unique movement, sine wave, and different names and different applications. And they say, and we can say, well, look, your Taekwondo Pumse is the same. They call it, I think, down block and then punch. No, but we do it in an upright stance because we're fighters and in Olympic, okay. So you see, that's just spin. We're just spinning it to make it more tasteful. The flavoring to make. Oh, our taste buds can swallow that now. But a front kick is a front kick. I don't want it. Yeah. Don't waste any time. A front kick is a front kick. So did we get it from Japan, Okinawa, China? I don't know. I mean. So it's funny that people look and say, these rearranged moves, because I don't know much about karate, but I'm sure Funakoshi did the same thing. He took movements. So it's silly, and it's a very circular type argument. And General Choi would say in his writings, arguing over the origin of martial arts is like arguing over where fire developed. It's not like you developed fire in your village, and then you made a fire and started sending smoke signals out with the directions of how to make a fire. Because I look and I say, what's that in the air? Is that a cloud? I don't know what a smoke is because I don't know what fire is. So how can I read the instructions on how to make a fire from your smoke signals? So obviously fire developed separately and apart in all places around the world. That same logic that General Choi uses is exactly applicable to the martial arts.
Yeah. You spoke about that forceful conscription.
Yes.
I get the word right. Into the Japanese army. Perhaps that's a good place to pick up General Choi's story. As I say, it's you can't separate the story of Taekwondo from the story of General Choi.
Right. Yes.
In my humble opinion, again.
Of course, yes.
I stand corrected. Obvious knowledge, but if we can pick his story up from there, then I'm sure there'll be lots of other information that will branch off from his journey.
Sure. Okay. So forcefully conscripted. There are detractors of General Choi that hate him, and they spread such slanderous lies about him. First of all, he did not volunteer for the Japanese army. He was forcefully conscripted. Yeah. Forcefully conscripted means you're drafted, you have no choice. And the same people that manufactured his lie have not done their homework. I do my research. I like to be thorough. And before I come public with something, I like to test it. and I like to see if it stands up to the test. So I like to ask about it. And so I had to delve into, again, history, not Taekwondo history, because Taekwondo history is purposely distorted for myriad reasons, and the reasons are very varied. So initially, the Japanese would not. Remember how well the war was going for the Japanese, similar to Europe. Hitler went into places and resistance was so weak, it was like they just marched in.
Yeah.
In some places, they did just march in. There was no resistance. And the same thing was happening in the Pacific region. If you look at the map, you'll see that Japan had the whole half a circumference. They were next going to go to Australia and next go to United States. And their target was the Pacific coast, the West Coast, California, Washington, and they would literally control the whole circle of the Pacific Ocean. So Japan was very modernized because they embraced the approach by the Western powers, and so they geared up their manufacturing, and that's one of the good things they did in Korea. They built manufacturing. They were starting to change it, to be like their annex, and move it from this farming, very rural, non-manufacturing base. So they were very powerful, and they were dominating there. So in the beginning, they only let people volunteer. And Park Chung-hee, we're moving from the early part of the World War II to 1961. Park Chung-hee was the military general that was behind the coup and took over and became the dictator for 18 and a half years. So he actually joined not one, but two military academies, one in Manchuria and then one like an imperial academy. And he graduated from two academies and was a Japanese military officer. So there were people that would join. And remember, there were people like General Choi that would go to Japan, the seat of the colonial government, just like the colonists in America would send their children to England and Great Britain to go to the universities there, right? Because this is the way to upward mobility. So it's very similar. And so you see, like when I talk from a historical standpoint, I make the analogies to other things in history. No different from anywhere else. Yeah, no different from anywhere else. So early on, it was just volunteering. And as the war went on, and then they bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States geared up, and they mobilized, Japan started making less and less gains and started losing more and more territory. And the war effort was turning. And it was clear from a Japanese perspective, we're going to lose this. And what they decided to do, and you can look, they have these things, you can read them as I've done. It went from volunteer only to a program to indoctrinate Koreans into being Japanese, to prepare them to serve in the military. Remember, you don't want to take into your armed forces people you are subjugating because now you're training them in your own ranks. And this is a very big problem in the American Revolution. The British would co-opt the African enslaved people to fight on the side of the British so they can get their freedom. And the colonies were very leery to have their enslaved people fight on their side, because in the middle of a battle, are they going to turn? These are serious type things. And the same thing happened. We ended slavery in the Civil War after we amended our Constitution, but the same dilemma. Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, get the enslaved people to fight for their freedom, right? And the Union took in the African slave that had escaped and used them to fight. And the South the Confederacy was very leery about that. And some they did it, some they didn't. But this was what was going on in Japan. So Japan knew they had this plan. I don't know if it was 5 years, but they had this plan where they would start with the indoctrination to build up the national pride in the Koreans to fight for the motherland, the Empire of Japan, the Emperor of Japan. And while they were doing that, they would increase recruitment efforts for people to volunteer. And so it was a simultaneous thing. And then in there, along this time period, they realized, Japanese were smart, they realized, oh, we will first forcefully conscript people living in Japan going to our universities. Not every student. It was the humanities and law. Those two categories. What was General Choi studying? He was studying law.
Right.
So he was in that initial group, and I forget how many thousands were forcefully conscripted. He was in that initial group to be conscripted. So when you read history, you'll see General Choi went in, I don't know if it was 1941. And again, I'm traveling, so I don't have my.
That's okay.
It's all off the top of my head. But he was in that initial group to be forcefully conscripted. So when people do this research on the surface, they will look and they will see that most sources say mandatory conscription began in, let's say, maybe it was 1943 General Choi went in. Maybe it began in 1944. And say, see, General Choi wasn't in 1944. He was in 1943. So therefore, he volunteered. No, it was a plan. And unless you I don't know if you've heard this before. Most people never heard this before because they're not history buffs and they're not doing the research into history. So yes, General Choi was forcefully conscripted because he was in that first batch to be forcefully conscripted. That was their test run. And they figured, well, they're living in Japan already. They're studying at the schools here. They are already further along in that indoctrination process. And General Choi, as we know, fervently resisted. We know, reading his memoirs, what he said, and all throughout his life, what he said. And more importantly, we know when he was forced to go into the Imperial Army, we know what he did. He didn't kill the Koreans. He didn't kill the Allied troops. He was instrumental in plotting to overthrow the local colonial apparatus where he was assigned. And this is documented in both North Korea and South Korea. It's one of the few things that both Koreas agree on. And both Koreas look at these people as heroes, whether they fought, like after the division became permanent, whether they settled in the North or settled in the South, they were looked upon heroes because you know why? There were very few Koreans that fought or tried to overthrow the colonial government. So in South Korea today, researchers are discovering this about General Choi, and they admire him greatly for it. And they are researching his anti-Japanese sentiment and what he actually did. And people have to understand, General Choi is buried in a cemetery for martyrs, for Koreans who resisted the Japanese occupation. And he's buried there because South Korea wouldn't let him. Oh, he made a dying wish. And of course, there's indication that Kim Il-sung stopped that from happening. But his dying wish was to be buried in a military cemetery in South Korea because he was a founding member of the Korean Army. He made it up to 2-star general. If not for the military coup and his subordinate General Park taking over, he was slotted for his 3rd star. He would have been a lieutenant general. So his military career was ended, and he was sent to Malaysia as ambassador. But so General Choi was conscripted into the Japanese army and became involved in this plot to overthrow the local colonial establishment. And then the ultimate goal was to head north to the border area with China and Russia, the Soviet Union in those days, and then fight with the resistance. That never happened because a Korean collaborator told on them, and they were imprisoned. And there's some accounts that say that he was sentenced to death. Some was life imprisonment. Some was a 7-year term. Then there's accounts where the sentence was upgraded to death because the defeat was imminent. And they wanted to eliminate all of these voices that could be used against them. And then the surrender came, and he was freed. Now, when he was freed, what did he do? He left that prison, the Japanese prison in that was physically in North Korea. Remember, Korea was one country at the time, but it was occupied by Japan, so it was a colony of Japan. He got out, and he heard about the growing movement to establish democracy in Seoul, and he goes south, and he joins the first military academy in January of 1946 and became a founding member of the Korean Army, what was to become the Korean Army. They called it the constabulary at the time. And in 1946, it was not allowed by the UN to build up these forces because, remember, they wanted the country to come together. So the American government got around it by saying the English language school. What they were doing was teaching English to the people that joined this school to become the leaders of the constabulary, which became the Korean Army. So in that initial class, there was 110 candidates. General Choi was number 44 out of 110. So he was a graduate. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and he was stationed to Gwangju, which is my teacher's hometown. And he tells a story about how he would teach the karate that he learned in Japan. And I want to back up. General Choi talks about Taekwondo, and it's a fallacy. It's a myth to think that he learned Taekwondo and he combined Taekwondo with karate to make Taekwondo. There is indication he didn't even know what Taekwondo was. But his calligraphy teacher did, in fact, and this is General Choi's own words. In the beginning, they portrayed General Choi as a Taekwondo master that combined his expert training in karate, and he makes Taekwondo. And that also is embellishment. So it is true from General Choi's own words that his teacher, calligraphy teacher, looked at him and said, this skinny little, scrawny little pint size, like a the sick puppy of the litter, he said, I got to do something about his physical constitution. He's so frail. He's so weak. So he would have him do basic exercises. Was these exercises push-ups and sit-ups and, calisthenics, or was it some kind of martial art thing? Yeah. It's basic exercise because he was so frail. Yeah. And he also was timid, and he would tell him stories about these people from Korea's past to bolster his confidence. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the extent of what he did with his calligraphy teacher. It wasn't formally Taekwondo. There's even a story, and the story is true. Whether or not the story is circulating, and there seems to be credible evidence to suggest that it's true. So when I'm bouncing around a lot because I need to in the narrative. So we're still in General Choi being conscripted, then getting out and moving to South Korea. But now we're going to advance forward. So in 1954, in the fall, he does a karate demonstration for the Korean president, Syngman Rhee. In this demonstration, the president is supposed to be impressed. Nam Tae-hee and Han Cha-kyo only did like a 15-minute routine. So they were told, do more. And so it was extended because it was going well. Supposedly the president was very impressed. And he said, this is Taekwondo. And the story goes that General Choi said, Taekwondo? What's Taekwondo? He didn't even know what it was. And it's quite possible he didn't know what it was. Maybe he did. That's not the point. The point is he knew what they were doing is not Taekwondo. It was Tang Sudo, Kang Sudo. It was basically karate. And Tang Soo Do and Kang Soo Do are Korean ways of calling it karate. Tang Soo Do is less of a Japanese connection because Kang Soo Do translates as karate. Tang Soo Do translate as way of China hand. So it's kind of like cutting Japan out and going back to China. So it's more palatable. So General Choi knew this is not Taekyon. So he did know that we can't call it Taekyon. So it's a moot point whether he knew it was or not. But here's the key point. This is the kicker. He now goes with Nam Tehi to the Chinese dictionaries. And he's looking up Taekyon. And guess what? They can't find it. And you look it up, you won't find it. You won't find it in the Japanese dictionaries is a really good indication of that it is wholly indigenous to Korea. Yeah. In other words, there is, so me and you speak English. Well, I speak American, you speak English. And I'll have to teach you how to speak proper American. Yeah. But we both speak English, and I'm sorry for, messing it up so much. The language that England gave the world. But we both speak English, and English has a phonetic alphabet. So does Korea. Korea has a phonetic alphabet. Now, if I give you the letter C-A-T, you'll know that says cat. You'll sound it out as cat. You won't know what a cat is unless when you were a little boy, they showed you the picture card and, to get you to how you pronounce cat, right? So it's the same thing with Korean. So if I say hot, H-O-T, I spell it out, those three letters, you'll say, oh, hot, yeah. And you might think it's temperature-wise. No, but it's also spicy food-wise, right? The temperature of the food can be hot, but the spice can be hot. And then, in my generation growing up, look at that woman. She's hot looking, right? Or the police are around. You're up to no good. The police are around. Hey, it's hot over here. Nobody's talking about the temperature. They're talking about the police attention. So the word in Korean has no meaning unless you understand what the meaning is. It's just a sound. Okay. So the way you learn the meaning of Korean words is to refer to the underlying Chinese Hanja. Yep. So the Chinese Hanja, they're looking in the dictionaries, they cannot find Taekyon. It's only in the Korean alphabet. So this is proof that Taekyon is a wholly indigenous activity to Korea, which is very, very important for Korean national pride and their nationalist purposes. So keeping that in mind, they look and they can't find it. Now, research indicates Taekyon is not in there, but Taekyon is a derivation of something else that's actually in the Chinese Hanja characters. So maybe Taekyon really isn't completely indigenous, but that's a whole nother topic. It really doesn't matter for Taekwondo. So knowing that General Choi now looks for Taekyon and it's not there, and we know it's not there because it's not there. Yeah. So now he looks and he needs to get the Korean president to write in calligraphy to authorize the name. Because remember, he's fighting for control of the martial arts. And he has something that nobody else has, direct access to the president. Why? He's a 2-star major general in the Korean army. Yep. And President Ri takes a liking to him. General Choi was a member of the Liberal Party, which Syngman Rhee was, and sort of had these connections. So he looks to try to figure a way to get him to write this calligraphy, because now he comes back and says, look, the president authorized this. You all use the Taekwondo name. So he said, this is all chess. It's a really strategic chess match that's going on with a lot of muscle. Yeah. It's not just pure strategy, it's muscle. And it's using power and influence, which further pisses off the ones on the civilian side because they don't have access to this and they're being steamrolled. Yep. So he thinks and thinks, and now he comes up and what does Tae mean? And Tae is a foot elevated off the floor, Okay. So if you go to the Chinese Hanja, there is a character for foot, but the character for Tae includes that character and it adds something else.
Okay.
That something else makes it the foot elevated off the floor. So if I ask somebody a foot elevated off the floor, what is that for? Oh, they're jumping. They're going to stamp. They're kicking, flying, or whatever. So general Choi, it's really a verb. It's showing action. You understand the distinction?
Yeah.
So that's what Tae is. So people say he came up with this very, very rare word. And if you ever want to do an experiment with this, go to a Chinese person that is very, very well schooled in the Chinese writing.
Yeah.
And General Choi was. Why? Calligraphy. You cannot write calligraphy unless you know Chinese characters. And the way you learn Chinese characters is by reading the Chinese classics.
Yeah.
You'll see General Choi's calligraphy, Confucius, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great Chinese scholar, philosopher, right? So this is the depth of General Choi's knowledge. So if you went to a Chinese person, and I've done that. I went to a librarian who's Chinese in the New York system, in an area where there's a lot of Chinese people.
Yep.
And I just showed her the character for Tae. And I said, excuse me, can you tell me what this means? And she would say, it's like a foot on a platform, or a foot up in the air, an elevated foot. And I went to people who, to the Chinese, so Chinese students go to a public school in America. And they go to private school, whatever, the full gamut. But when they go to school, they're not learning Chinese. Chinese is not a subject that is prevalent in the school system here. But Chinese parents of some affluence, they have Chinese schools. They send them to afterwards. They get extra tutoring and they get taught Chinese.
Yep. Yep.
And I went to a teacher of Chinese in one of these schools, because my school had, my Taekwondo dojang had a lot of Chinese in our neighborhood, and they had a Chinese school right around the corner from me. And as a matter of fact, the parents of one of my of two of my students were both Chinese, very well schooled in the Chinese language, and they confirmed this as well. So that's what it means. It's like an action word of
Right.
foot elevated. So people like Grandmaster J.C. Kim Jung Chan, they actually say General Choi combined these two characters and created the Tae thing. But if you ask somebody to read the Tae, and you don't put it Taekwondo, because they'll say, oh, Taekwondo, what's that? Oh, it's karate, it's martial arts, something like that. They'll say Kung Fu, whatever. Some will know, oh, it's the Korean thing that's in the Olympics. But don't just do the Tae character, and they'll say it's a foot elevated off the floor. So see, General Choi takes this and he says to the president, please write it. And he plays to his ego. He says, your hand, your calligraphy pen, your hand is so gifted. Your calligraphy is very artistic. So don't write it in Korean, because if you write it in Korean, if you notice, excuse me, sorry about that. If you notice, like, I can't read Korean or Chinese, but I can notice the difference in the characters. The Chinese characters are very intricate, very complex, and the Korean characters are very simple. The Korean characters actually mimic the shape of the mouth that when you say these sounds. It's a brilliantly devised system. So when you write something in Korean, you don't have the ability to have that artistic character to it, the artistic slant. So he convinced him to write it in Korean, and he provided him with the characters. Now, Taekyon, we know, doesn't appear in Chinese. It only appears in Korean. And Taekyon phonetically sounds like Taekwon, Taekwon. And he adds the do, which was very prevalent in those days. They added the do. The do does not mean the way. The do is the Tao, like Taoism. So it's not do, it's Tao. And the Tao or Tao is a religious system. And it is the way of moral living. Taoism demands strict adherence to certain moral characters and moralistic behavior. So it's not suffice enough to say hand and foot fighting, the way of hand and foot fighting.
Yep.
It is much more is this physical activity that coincides with this moral living to be on the side of justice.
Dr. Vitale, we stalled for a small second there. Just as you were about to give the proper translation, can you just repeat that a wee bit?
Sure, of course, yes. The Taekwondo does not mean the way of hand and foot fighting. It is much deeper than that, because the Do is not Do, it's Tao, and it goes to Taoism. So Taoism is the moral adherence to a strict code of morality. So Taekwondo is the physical activity to train within to have this better moral living. It's much deeper than just kicking and punching, the way to kick and punch. Because when I say to people, like I asked you what the Tae means, and it's deeper than just the foot. And I hope you grasp that now. I hope the audience grasps that. The Do is the same way. So when I say to somebody, what does the Do mean? Oh, it's the way. And I say to them, which way? Oh, the way of hand and foot fighting. But why are you hand and foot fighting? Are you beating up your girlfriend? Are you beating up the bully? Are you stopping a robbery? Are you beating up to steal something yourself? I mean, what do you mean by that? And without understanding what the character Do is actually writing, and you'll see it's the same characters used for Taoism or Taoism. This religious beliefs that adhere to strict morality. So I think that's very, very important for people to understand. And this shows the deep thinking of General Choi. He was a very, very deep thinker. So now he gets this name written on the scroll. South Korea lies about it. It's a forgery. It doesn't exist. If it exists, where is it? And General Choi said, when they asked him, where is it? He goes, I fled Korea for my life. I only told my wife I'm not coming back. And when I left, I was going on a 2-week journey to teach Taekwondo. We had events lined up, and I traveled quite frequently for Taekwondo. So I was leaving, and I packed a bag for 2 weeks to show I'm coming back. I couldn't take all these things that I wanted to take with me, including his family. Remember, he's fleeing from a brutal dictatorship that is after him. They want to make an example of him because he's an outspoken critic. So who knows if he would have been killed, thrown in prison as a political prisoner, if they just would have wrestled Taekwondo from him. We don't know what would have happened because he fled. There's a good indication he would have been put under house arrest. And, they wanted to silence him. Because remember, he travels around the world teaching this new martial art. And when he's finished teaching the martial art, what does he do? He has dinner at nighttime with people from the embassy, the consulate, the Korean community living overseas, and he riles them up. And when he's having dinner with the staff of the Korean embassy or Korean consul, who's there? KCIA. The British Secret Service, American CIA, Korean CIA, all embassies around the world have intelligence people assigned there, legitimately registered with the host government. It's not a secret. They're not working covertly. They're there, and that's part of their diplomatic mission. Nothing improper about it. I'm not talking about people working the streets covertly, stealing things and being spies. I'm not talking about that. So when they go out to eat, here's the KCIA guy, and he's listening to General Choi trash the dictator.
Yep.
And he's saying to himself, whoa, promotion for me. I'm going to get a big raise. Yep, he goes back and he's sending the information to Seoul. Look what this guy's saying and doing. So General Choi was a very outspoken, highly vocal critic of the regime. And he never looked at Park as a legitimate president. He always looked at him as a dictator. And he kept telling him from day one, we stabilized the government with the coup. I supported the coup, as did most of the generals did. They didn't know he was leading the coup. They thought he was the front man. And the guy leading the coup was the ROK Army Chief of Staff, a Lieutenant General Cho Dae-young, who was very well liked. But Park Chung-hee very soon put him under house arrest, back when the coup first happened.
Yep.
He let him exist for a brief period of time. He solidified his rule, put him under house arrest. What did he do with General Choi? Sent him out as ambassador.
Yep.
You know, people he killed. People he would lock up, he did. Other people, house arrest, different things, removed as political prisoners. They would manufacture, oh, this person a communist, this person a Japanese sympathizer, collaborator. So General Choi couldn't do it. They couldn't do any of that with him. So they promoted him, right? And they moved him out. Now, where is General Choi? He's in Malaysia. All of the people that didn't support Park Chung-hee, the general, now were removed, and he solidifies his power. So General Choi now gets this calligraphy, and now he has the power to push this martial art. And because he was such a political person, it impacts his ability to control Taekwondo. So in the beginning, he had the power to control, the political power to control Taekwondo. As a military general in a developing country, the military is very, very important. So he is a very powerful, influential figure. But as he goes against that dictator, he loses his power, and he gets more and more confined to what he can do. So he leaves. And the reason he doesn't have this calligraphy is because he couldn't take everything he needed to take with him. He's going on a 2-week trip and doesn't come back. So where is his calligraphy? We don't know. And they lied about it. The most influential figure in the WTF side of Taekwondo said very clearly that General Choi lied about this. It's a forgery, and if he had it, if it existed, he'd have it. Now, nobody knows what happened to it. General Choi said it was in his office when he left, and he doesn't know what happened to it because he doesn't know what happened to any of this stuff. You know, because remember, it took a while for him to get his wife and daughter out, one daughter. And they kept his son and other daughter there. And it was, you know, it was a chess thing, right? This cat and mouse game. Oh, General Choi, come home. They sent people to General Choi in Canada. Sir, come home, come home, come home. We'll give you any job you want. We'll give you, or we'll make you the foreign minister. That's, you know, like the U.S. Secretary of State, your foreign secretary. You know, so that's what they offered, and he turned it down. So now they say, you're never going to see your family. And he says, okay, so be it. I'm not going back home. So he calls their bluff, because now they say, oh, so they say, we'll let out the wife and one daughter, and we'll see everything's okay. Boom. Now mom is outside the country. She'll get dad. Hey, we got to go back to our 2 kids. We can't leave them as orphans. And General Choi says, sorry, not going back. And
what year would he have?
So he leaves. He flees in secret. January 1972.
Right. Okay.
January 1972. And so now the pressure is to come back to get his son and daughter. And we don't know. I know how the wife and daughter got out. You know, Jun Rhee, he had students. He had a student who I interviewed at his home in Dominican Republic. He was from a family in Dominican Republic and was able to come to Texas to study at the university. He met Jun Rhee there, trained under him, then went back home. You know, Dominican Republic, if you go to an American university, you come back home, you're in line to get pretty good jobs. He worked at the U.S. Embassy, had a lot of connections, and he eventually gave up working in the embassy because he started teaching Taekwondo and was making so much money. But it was through his connections, Jun Rhee and this guy, Jose Cookie Reyes, and General Choi, that they spoke to the Dominican president, who had a very good relationship with Park Chung-hee from Korea, and they brokered a deal, let his wife and one daughter out. And then from there, they went to North America and up to Canada. And we don't know why he let the son and remaining daughter out. And that was a bit later, you know, it goes over a period of time. And we assume that since General Choi is not going home, and now mommy's gone, and she's in Canada, the 2 kids are orphans. So what is the Korean CIA and the South Korean dictatorship going to do with these 2 kids? Things will turn on them now, because now they're the ones keeping the kids they're the bad guys. So eventually they let them out. And General Choi's son, President Choi Jung-hwa, he said to me, we would just at the house, and they were teens at the time, living in the family house, and they would have other family members come and, you know, check with them. They were pretty much self-reliant at the time. His sister was older, but he just remembered the time the government came, the government meaning the KCIA, pack your stuff, you're going. And they didn't know where they're going. Oh my God, where are we going? Oh, we, you know, but they eventually got to Canada and reunited. So all of this plays into the whole thing where there's animosity between the two rival groups. We find the calligraphy in the 1959 book because General Choi said, oh, it's not there because I left. But he said, oh, get the 1959 book because it's in there, you know? And it was. So once we got that book, now we had the evidence, not only the calligraphy itself, but the story from, I don't know if it was from the Rock Army Chief of Staff or the White or the Blue House Chief of Staff, but somebody inside the administration wrote a letter, you know, establishing that the president wrote this because this is the name of the Korean national martial art. So that's all in that 59 book. And that 59 book, like all other General Choi's books, were ordered to be destroyed when he left. And the, you know, Park Chung-tae's teacher, one of his two teachers, was a Colonel Kim Soo-ryan, who was the pioneer of Taekwondo in India. He was from Gwangju, my teacher's hometown, and Park Chung-tae's hometown. My teacher actually knew Park Chung-tae. They went to the same high school together. But he preserved that book. Now, he was a colonel in the military, and he could have been in a lot of trouble, I guess, if they found that. But he donated that book to the Taekwondo Wan, so it's in the museum there. And when the museum curator was giving me a private tour, a very nice Korean lady, has a master's degree in history, nothing to do with Taekwondo. She's giving me a private tour of the museum, and I'm pointing out some discrepancies. And to their credit, many of the discrepancies they corrected. And it was easy to see they were corrected because there was things that were just laminated or glued on with the correct information. It was very obvious to see. So it was really cool they did that. At first, they didn't do it. The next administration came in and they asked me about whatever. And I said, no, you guys are wasting my time. I said, I wrote like 8 pages of things and I did a whole thing. Oh, I don't have it. I said, well, I gave it. I submitted it. Well, that was before my time. Can you resubmit it? And to his credit, he did have some of those things corrected. So I was very impressed by them. But when this museum curator is giving me this tour, she says, she brings me to there's a horizontal. General Choi from Sigmund Rhee is vertical, the calligraphy. The one from Park Chung-hee is horizontal. And that one was March 1971, right after Kim Il-sung became president of KTA in January 1971. Within 2 months, he got Park Chung-hee to write in Korean Hangul Kuki Taekwondo. Okay. And she's pointing to that and she goes, that's the original. I said, oh, no, it's not. She goes, no, that's the original, in her Korean accent. That's original. I said, no, ma'am, it's not. No, I'm curator. I know that's original. I said, no, ma'am, it's not. And she goes, yeah. I said, no, that's March, I think it's 21st, 1971. Because the date is on it, but I wasn't looking. I just, have this photographic memory. And she goes, that's not the original. The original one is from 1950s. That's a Park Chung-hee. Yeah, that's I said, no. Original one's a Sigmund Rhee. I said, which original? 1950s or 1970s? What do you mean? I said, you have it. No, I never see. I said, yes, you have it. I never see. I said, I don't know if you saw it or not. This what I'm relaying is exactly what happened. This New York style, right? So I said, you have it. Maybe you didn't see it, but you have it. And I took her by the hand and I started walking with her back to the book, the 1959 book that's opened up to, I don't know what it was open to, some technique in it. Yep. And I said, in this book on page 6, it's not page 6. I was just making up a number, but it's in the beginning, in the very beginning of the book, is that calligraphy. She grabs her portable radio and she's calling to the office. Somebody bring down the key because she's got. I said, no, relax. It's there. Do it later. Trust me, I don't lie. It's there. and it's there. So see, whenever you lie, the lie will always come back. When you interview somebody in a crime, you let them talk, because the more they talk, they are trying to get themselves out of trouble, right? They're trying to manufacture something that didn't happen to cover what happened.
Yeah.
You will remember on this date, March 8th, my father would have been 104 today.
Wow.
We will always remember we talked. We might not remember everything we talked about. You might say, "Oh, this guy didn't shut up" or whatever, but you'll remember history. On March 8th, 2021, we had this conversation through Zoom.
Yeah,
that's factual. So when you lie about stuff, you can never remember them, because it's not. It didn't occur. It's manufactured. So this is what they've been doing. They've been lying. So General Choi has the calligraphy, and the story goes, when he came up with the name Taekwondo, he called in his team of, in the Otakwan, and he had to move the chairs and tables and desks, whatever, out of the way in whatever office room they were in. And then he told Nam Tahi, Nam, and he points, go up on the floor, and General Choi has his manuscript. And he's starting to read out the 29 movements of Warang. He's talking him through these movements.
Yep.
And then after this is done, he calls him, sit here. And he comes, sits next to him, and he hands him the manuscript, and he tells him, order the sergeant to come up, Master Sergeant Han Chak-kyo. So the junior subordinate officer, which is Nam Tahi, calls up Han Chak-kyo, and he's got the 30 movements of Chung Mu. And he's calling out these movements of Chung Mu. And these are the first two patterns developed, and supposedly that's how they came online. And now General Choi said, this is the Korean martial art, and this is the name, Taekwondo. Yeah. So we don't know when that happened. We know it happened after the fall. In September of 1954, they did the demonstration, and then they had these series of meetings, and then it was trying to get, General Choi knew something of this importance, and especially because he's fighting these contentious Kwan heads that didn't even look at him as their level, because older Kwan's new on the block.
Yep.
So he realized he needs to get authorization, and he can't get presidential authorization unless he gets members of society, other generals, politicians, newspaper people, business people. So that's why he has these series of meetings to gain support to approach this idea for the president to authorize the name and actually do the calligraphy. So there's a series of meetings. So my guess is that April 11, 1955 is when he does this with Warang Chung Mu and introduces to the soldiers. There's an urban myth that circulates on the internet that Sun Duck Sun came up with the name Taekwondo. It's ludicrous. Sun Duck Sun appears in interviews in print, never mentions he came up with the name. He wrote 2 books. His books are called Korean Karate. Never mentions he came up with the name Taekwondo. And even I just found last night on the internet, a student of his posted a program of some event that was held in the United States. And in the program is the picture of the meeting that took place in December of 1955 with Sun Duck Sun and General Choi sitting at the meeting. And when you look at the caption, the type for the caption underneath, you can see is whited out and typed in by typewriter, Mr. Sun. So they obviously took out General Choi's name and put in Mr. Sun. And the Mr. Sun, the type doesn't match, the typesetting doesn't match, and MR period, S-O-N, is obviously much smaller than General Chae Hung-hee or General Choi, right? Or Chae Hung-hee. So you can see the adding in of the Mr. Sun is not centered. It's not in a line because it was added in. So one student who I dialogued on, another student, not this one, that I dialogued over the internet with, he said he never thought Sun Duck Sun said he came up with the name. he said he submitted it on paper voting for it.
Okay.
So regardless of any of that, it doesn't matter. The name came up with General Choi and Colonel Nam in the military and introduced to the military troops. The soldiers that were there at the time confirmed they were using the name in the military before they sought permission. And Grandmaster Kim Bok-man tells the story very clearly that they knew this was a big deal and they needed to get permission. So they needed to start networking to get it. So clearly they had this name well before Sun Duc-sun was sitting in that meeting. But see, again, if somebody says, and I believe it was done at a dinner, and Sun Duc-sun hated General Choi, they became bitter enemies. General Choi was the one that orchestrated him being removed from the Cheongdokwan. He was mad at General Choi because in 1959, General Choi takes a military Taekwondo team to Vietnam and Taiwan to demonstrate. First time ever Taekwondo is demonstrated abroad. So he was left off the team, and General Choi said, well, you're not in the military. You can't be on a military team.
Yeah.
It was all military personnel. And I have the roster. It's all military personnel with their military serial numbers. So Sun Duc-sun, and I can understand him being upset at it, but this is a route. There are more routes to why the relationship soured. At first, it was a relationship made in heaven, mutually beneficial. And then General Choi, being this very powerful, domineering, influential person, started exerting more and more influence in the Cheongdokwan. He couldn't lead the Cheongdokwan because he's in the military, so that's why he was honorary director. But he is more and more exerting what he wants. Some of the pioneers that were students at the Cheongdokwan would say General Choi's calligraphy we all over the place, and all the sayings that he, these great sayings from Confucius and from the Chinese classics, these idioms, there's tidbits of wisdom. And if you even see, you always have to collaborate things. When you see that Lee Won-guk was sitting there at the Cheongdokwan, you will see General Choi's calligraphy in the background. So all these things start to make sense when you piece them together. But some people think that Sun Duc-sun came up with the name, and it's ridiculous. I've had a student say to me, and others, Korean pioneer grandmasters, he was, again, I'm not being derogatory, but Grandmaster Sun, although was an outstanding Korean martial artist and is an iconic legend, suffered because he was a Korean during the occupation and didn't have much of a formal education. Mm-hmm. So he didn't know much as far as education goes. He certainly wouldn't have known Chinese Hanja. Yeah. Certainly wouldn't have known it to the extent where he can find a very rare character like Tae. Yep. When I told you I spoke to the librarian and the Chinese tutor about this, they say it's rarely used. It's old. It's like, oh, how'd you find this? Like, why are you asking this? Because it's just not something that's used. So I've had Korean pioneers. One in particular did very serious research on the history of Taekwondo and interviewed Sun Duc-sun. They give this no credence whatsoever. And he never said that outside of his circle. He said that in his circle of students, and they started circulating it until somebody like me came and said, are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. See, so we know where the name came from, and it was General Choi's, it was his conception. And we know what the motivation was. And now he's using that name, and he tries then to form a Korean Taekwondo Association. It doesn't last. And it's with the 6 kwans in 1959. It doesn't last much. General Choi goes away to be in Malaysia to be ambassador. The Taekwondo Association is created, and eventually General Choi becomes the 3rd president of that. And in January 1965, gets elected to a 1-year term. And on August 5th, by him to take his Taekwondo name. The Taekwondo name is dropped, and they take the Taekwondo name. Yep. His Taekwondo name as their preferred label. And when General Choi is forced out, they want to go back to Taekwondo. They want to go back to Taekwondo. And when Kim Won-young comes, he says, we're not going back to Taekwondo. Why would we do that? General Choi already has a platform, a base he spread around the world. We're just going to work off that, build from that, and co-opt that. And that's what they did. They would bribe people. They would pay them off. And some people just said, I'm sick of General Choi. He's too much of an autocratic leader. His way or the highway. I'm making money here. I don't need this. I'm going off on my own. Some said, whoa, wait a second. I'm a Korean living overseas. I want to support my home, my native country. I'm going to join the new WTF. And so there's a lot of all that. But some of it, like with my teacher and so many others, Grandmaster Riki Ha, his family suffered. Grandmaster Riki Ha, the most loyal student ever of Taekwondo. Why? From start to finish, he never left the ITF. He never left General Choi.
Yeah.
That's why he was the best student ever of Taekwondo. Yeah. And nothing to do with technique, although he's a Superman. There's no doubt about that. But it's because of his steadfast loyalty to General Choi. And he told me horror stories about what happened to his family. Casey used to follow him when he went to South Korea. They hold him up at the airport. It was just awful. His family told me of how they suffered there. And when I went to interview Kim Won-young, we parked the car in the garage of his office building, and we rented an SUV, and we could never open the back. We just could not open it. We did not know how to open it. And it was not a Korean vehicle. It was, I think, an American-made vehicle, but we just could not figure out how to open it. So every time we'd have to put the seat down and open up the back door and put all the equipment in there. We go up to the office to interview, and we come down. The film crew, we get in the car, he starts the thing up, and he sees on the dashboard, the rear thing is open. Wow. So we're like, what is up with that? We couldn't open it. We know it wasn't us. And when we went there, we were driving, it wasn't open. When we parked the car, we didn't try to open it. We took everything out the back doors because the seat was down. And we're like, what's up with this? And what's the assumption? Yep. KTIA is listening to us too. So this intrigue is wild. But so that's how General Choi, moved forward with the name, and he created his martial art based upon these patterns. They were very popular. The majority of the Koreans started to doing them. And they were very popular because they were named after these great Korean patriots, these iconic figures or significant dates or events or themes in Korean culture and Korean history. So now we fast forward, and after General Choi's 1-year term is up, he's forced out of the KTA. They don't let him run again. And they help him set up the ITF, and now there's the ITF and KTA, and now there's 2 competing organizations. And General Choi is going to build the Kukiwon. Not that he was going to call it the Kukiwon, but he has the plans for this headquarters for the ITF, International Training Center. Yeah. And we have the plans. I have the actual, drawing of it. Grandmaster Kim Jong-chan, who was General Choi's right-hand man in the 60s in Korea, one of his students' father was an architect, and that's where they got the plans from. So General Choi had gotten permission for the land, and now he's going to get funds, and the KTA is going ballistic. Because remember, the KTA is the actual entity, Korean entity, that's registered with the Korean government that supervises Taekwondo in Korea. General Choi eventually would register the KTA with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a social organization for international goodwill, and the Minister of Education in South Korea. So it was registered. I have those serial numbers. I have that all that stuff. And but the KTA, make no mistake, they are the ones that's supposed to be dispatching instructors abroad and controlling Taekwondo inside of Korea from a government standpoint. And General Choi would dispatch people abroad. Why? Because he had a network there already. They're sponsoring them. And General Choi's got the connections in the foreign ministry because it's a military government. He was a military general. And all these people in government are his old subordinates, his friends, his colleagues, his peers. So he's getting his followers to get passports to get, because you couldn't, like in UK, United States, you want a passport, you just go apply for it.
Yeah.
You just pay the money, fill out the application, and if you're a British citizen, American citizen, they issue a passport. There's no questions, there's no authorization you need to get. In Korea, to get a passport to travel abroad, you needed to get permission to get that, and that's why Ricky Ha and CK Choi are the first two dispatched abroad with Taekwondo instructor, actually listed as their occupation on the passport. They weren't the first two Taekwondo instructors to go abroad. General Choi was, and then Kim Bak-man and Lieutenant Woo Jae Lim. Kim Bak-man was a master sergeant, and Woo Jae Lim was a lieutenant. They were out of the military, and General Choi sent them to Malaysia because this thing's going crazy, and they become these instrumental pioneers in Southeast Asia. But so the KTA and ITF, the civilians and General Choi are really going at it, and the KTA objects to General Choi trying to get funding to build his headquarters. Yeah. So General Choi says to the government, "What are you talking about? I'm Taekwondo, Korean martial art. Yep. We're the national martial art of Korea. Just 2 years before, you funded our Goodwill tour to go around the world. They distributed the Taekwondo book, the English book that said Taekwondo, Korean martial art of self-defense." I said, "What are you talking about? These guys are karate. Do you want to fund a center for Japanese karate in Korea?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" Go ask them what they're doing. They're doing Japanese kata. And, the civilian, "What's kata?" He goes, "I'll tell you. Warang Chungmu Uji." That's, Dangundo. So General Choi is winning the argument. And then what's the KTA do? Oh, my God, he's right. That's when they very quickly put together the Palge. Okay. The set of forms. So they go and say, no, we're Korean Taekwondo. He's international Taekwondo. This is going on. Then, of course, General Choi leaves. They build the Kukiwon. They name it that. But that was all General Choi's vision. The Kukiwon hosted the first World Championships of Taekwondo in 1973. First ever. It was not the WTF World Championships. It's the KTA World Championships. Because why? The WTF didn't exist then. When the tournament ended, all the medals are awarded. They have a meeting and they establish the WTF. So the WTF couldn't host the first World Championship because they weren't in existence yet. Yeah. So it was the first World Championships hosted by the KTA, and it was hosted in the Kukiwon. Why the Kukiwon? The Kukiwon was the central gymnasium for the KTA. Yeah. So now when General Choi leaves after Kim Il-young comes, and Kim Il-young said publicly, "I was sent by the Blue House to clean up the mess in Taekwondo," and the mess being General Choi and the struggle for control. And I have a picture. Park Chung-hee goes to Germany, West Germany in that day, right? Germany's divided, part of the Cold War, settlement of World War II, like Korea. But sadly, Korea wasn't an aggressive country. It was not an aggressor. It was not a belligerent. It was an innocent occupied country. So why were they divided? If you're going to divide anybody, why don't you divide Japan? Because you divided Germany. But the division happened because Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, one of my great heroes, Sir Winston Churchill, I probably think I don't know what the world would be like if he wasn't at the helm in those days. The sheer determination. I really admire the Brits. Boy, the tenacity, what they went through. I'm telling you, big admirer. But anyway, these three come up with the plan that whoever liberates a country will help that country reestablish. So obviously, the Soviets came in on one side of Germany and the Allied troops came in another side of Germany. And that was the same case in Korea. So that's why they were divided. And Japan, the Soviets never entered. The US was there already. So that's why Japan wasn't divided. But the division was because whoever liberated the country would now set up the government. So it shouldn't have been a problem, but it was because the Soviets and the Allies had competing ideologies. So each one wanted a satellite following their political and ideological system. So when you look at Taekwondo, you have this same type of divide in that same realm. And General Choi is now forced out of Korea because Kim Il-young comes in and he's going to clean up Taekwondo. And I was mentioning about that picture. So in the late 60s, Park Chung-hee goes to West Germany. And there's a bunch of Western students. Western, meaning American GIs and Germans,
Yep.
standing at the airport with the little Korean flags. So this president gets, Korea in those days, very poor country. I don't even think they had their own jet. It might have been a commercial flight.
Yep.
But this president gets off the plane, was walking through the terminal, and he sees all these Westerners with the Korean flag. And he walks over to them. He says, why are you, and they said, sir, my Taekwondo instructor said the president of his country is coming. We have to welcome you to Germany.
Wow.
So Park Chung-hee was very smart, very shrewd, said, wow, look at the power that Taekwondo has as a political and cultural propaganda tool.
Yep.
So he also followed the Japanese model about sport and building national pride. So he put a lot of money into building the sport program in South Korea, very instrumental in getting the Olympics, even though he was killed before that. He really put this push in there, and the generals that followed him continued along with that. Kim Il-sung deserves great credit for that. I call him the father of Olympic Taekwondo. Without Dr. Kim Il-sung, Taekwondo is not in the Olympics, no question at all. I know him and General Choi didn't get along, but because they didn't get along doesn't mean I can't credit both people with what they gave us. So there was a lot of support going into Taekwondo because, today, we have Korean vehicles, Hyundai, Kia, right? And we have Samsung, the phone, what is the Galaxy rivaling the iPhone, and Daewoo and all these other electronics and whatnot come out of South Korea. So none of that happened early on. The only thing that was exported from Korea was Taekwondo.
Yeah.
And they built this image abroad of Taekwondo. They taught us Korean culture, Korean history. They would send money back to Taekwondo. People living like myself, I don't know how many times I've been to Korea. I go to Korea as a tourist. I deposit my tourist dollars there. This is really, really great for Korea. They've gotten into the Olympics. So you have all of this tension. And but that's how General Choi got into it and rose up. We know he studied karate in Japan. Did he get black belt? I don't know. Did he get second degree black belt? I don't know. I'm not saying one way or the other because there's no independent verification. He says he did. Yeah. I'm not saying he didn't. I just say we can't prove it. There are other people that said he was a color belt, maybe only a green belt. Okay. I've heard other accounts he was only a brown belt. I don't know. I really don't care. Because we know what his background was. He was told stories about Taekyon or these exercises and, whatever it was. And he learned some basic rudimentary karate in Japan. So did these other Koreans. It was all basic rudimentary karate. There is no independent verification of any original Kwan founder, their rank, none whatsoever. Nobody has ever produced a certificate. Nobody. Nobody. So we know people say Lee Won-guk was a first degree. We know some people say he was a second degree, some people was a third degree, some people was a fourth degree. I don't know what he was. All I know is he was an iconic figure, pivotal in the history of the development of Taekwondo because he opened up a very influential Chung Do Kwan. Yep. And from there, those students created Taekwondo. So I'm not discounting that. What did he teach? We know what he taught. He taught Japanese karate. It was very rudimentary. We know what his students say they learned. Some of them still to this day are teaching that same system, more or less. So those things are easily verifiable. There's nothing complex about it. There's nothing deep about it. So did General Choi have this extensive training? Well, he had minimal training. I don't know. I only know his finished product. His finished product was not created solely by him. He had the input of many, many people, including some very highly competent and well thought of instructors from the Chung Do Kwan, very talented black, at what people accomplish. And if you tell me that General Choi had no extensive formal training, then I say, geez, that doesn't diminish him. That increases his creative genius.
Yep.
His creative genius. Because look what this man accomplished. Nobody, no martial artist, no Korean, no Chinese, no Japanese, no martial artist ever accomplished what General Choi did. He had over 100 countries following his system. He would have 50 to 70 to 80 countries show up at a world championship, where the gold medal standard, right, the world champion was the one that performed the patterns that he devised to the standard he insisted. That's unprecedented task.
Yeah.
Nobody wrote the types of textbooks he did, including a 15-volume encyclopedia of Taekwondo. Nobody. And I forget, I was up to 12, maybe 13. That's unprecedented. Bruce Lee, had books translated, no question. Maybe more languages, but Bruce Lee never wrote, a 15-volume encyclopedia documenting a fairly complete system of martial art. It's nobody. The next one in my mind, especially in a Korean perspective, would be Masoyama. But Masoyama was promoting Japanese karate under a Japanese name. He abandoned his Korean given name, the name he was born to, which also was Choi, by coincidence. But certainly the next one is Wan Ki, the Mudokan founder. His Tang Sudo that he first named Wasudo, then he used the Tang Sudo label that Lee Won-guk came up with, and then eventually moved to the Wasudo label when he found that old book and knew about Korea's past and Subakdo. So he Wasudo to Tangsudo to Subakdo, because Subaki, again, he meaning indicates it was a type of a game or sporting thing, not really a martial art. So he dropped the HI and put in the DO for the do. So Wan Ki was another brilliant Korean martial artist. Not a Taekwondo man, and again, it's not a slant, a slag, or a dig at him. Not at all, because it was miraculous what he did. But what he did was paled in comparison to, General Choi and the ITF. But Wan Ki and General Choi are two people that the South Korean authorities badmouth. Why those two? Why Wan Ki and Chae Hung Hee? Well, because those are the two that didn't sign on for the sport movement.
Yeah.
They didn't sign on to the sport movement. They were ostracized. And Wan Ki did not flee Korea. He stayed and fought, to his credit, and he prevailed in the courts. He won a series of court cases so that were forced to leave him alone. They tried to destroy him. They split his Mudokan, and then a significant group of his students left and went to the Kukiwon and KTA, and were instrumental in helping that to grow. The Mudokan senior that left became one of the iconic figures in leading the Kuki Taekwondo's development. So that's it in a nutshell of how General Choi came on the scene, what his background was. But I have to reiterate, here is a guy that you're saying did not have extensive martial arts experience, and people will poo-poo him because he was in jacket and tie, and he's not in a traditional martial art uniform, a gi, a dobak, or whatever. He's this image of like a leader, not an actual hands-on instructor. But that doesn't mean anything. Remember, he set the standard for what 100 plus countries around the world are trying to follow, and 50 to 80 of them show up at a world championship every 2 years and are trying to emulate. And the gold medal standard, the one that comes closest to that standard, is the world champion. I mean, nobody did that. And I don't know how you say General Choi was not a martial artist. He was a martial artist in every sense of the word. He put his Taekwondo in front of his own family, no matter how late he was up, no matter how much he drank the night before when he's out traveling and celebrating with people. He was up at the same time in the morning, pounding those walls and posts and conditioning his hand and doing his calisthenics. There's a really great video they did. They interviewed General Choi towards the end of his life at his home in Canada, and he's in his pajamas and he's doing his stretching and calisthenics, and this was his routine no matter where he was. General Choi would say it, but the people that traveled with him would say it. they would say, they would hear like this thumping, and they would see him, like some of them roomed with him. The funds are low. He didn't even have his own room, and he didn't mind that. He really was like this general, which you could see as aloof, but he really was a man of the people. He just loved his country, and he loved his martial art, and he loved making people better through it. And it's a shame that his reputation has been dragged through the mud for dirty political Korean politics, which has nothing to do with me and you. Me and you can fight over should the UK Brexit or not. Did Donald Trump was good for USA, good for the world or not? We can argue over that. That's politics. That has nothing to do with our Taekwondo. We're martial art brothers. We have this camaraderie. So it's a shame that Korean politics, not Taekwondo politics, Korean politics has hurt us so much.
Yeah.
But that's how we came in, and the overview there. Yeah.
One final question or one subject that I really want to cover, and it relates slightly to just what you were talking about there about General Choi's actual ability as a physical martial artist.
Mhm.
And I've heard this. I was involved in. I've involved myself in this debate in my younger, more arrogant, more ill-informed years, and I'm happy to admit that now. Was about the creation of the patterns. So we've ended up with 24 patterns. I'm a member of AMA, which as a student of Grandmaster Choi, we study the original. Again, it's up for debate. The original 20 patterns, and there's always a debate. It seems to be about who created the patterns, who developed the patterns, who actually made the patterns up. So this is a wonderful opportunity that I have with your good self sitting in front of me to ask that question and hopefully get a definitive answer on that.
Sure. Okay. So I would say several people. There was a guy named Chae Hung-hee that created the patterns. There was this military general called the Chae Hung-hee, General Chae Hung-hee. He created the patterns. There was this ambassador. He was the first Korean ambassador to Malaysia, Ambassador Chae Hung-hee. He created the patterns. There was this guy that moved from Korea to Canada. His name was Chae Hung-hee. He created the pattern.
Wonderful. Yep. Yep.
Created the patterns. Yeah. Yep.
So
that's right.
When he was, is it factual that he had all of the pattern movements in his head? He was the one who said that it's this move followed by this move followed by this move.
Correct. Okay, so I was being a little obnoxious in saying Chae Hung-hee. No, on purpose.
Yep.
That's the pushy New Yorker. I want to hammer home the message. Chae Hung-hee created the ITF Taekwondo patterns. They were his creation from his brain. This does not mean he did it alone. This does not mean he didn't have suggestions, input, and feedback. He solicited feedback. And so I recounted earlier the first two patterns developed, Hwarang and Chungmu. Several sources all confirm that. Yep. And these patterns were developed after the demonstration in 1954, September, in front of President Syngman Rhee. Why? Because they weren't performed in the demonstration. So if he was putting this out, I just have to stop. Hwarang is, these 2 points is very important. Hwarang, the first pattern developed. There was a colonel in the military, a subordinate to General Choi, that General Choi knew very well. And if you look at the 1972 textbooks, the Bible of Taekwondo, there was 6 editions and 2 reprints. In those books is the history of martial arts, the origins of martial arts, and the history of Taekwondo. Those were written by this Dr. Lee and Colonel. He was the president of a university in South Korea at the time when he wrote this. Uh, these accounts are appeared in the 72 book and were repeated in the encyclopedia. I believe they were, I don't know if they were in a magazine article or a paper or a newspaper that was written, back obviously before 72 in Korea. So this man was a historian that made it up to, I think, lieutenant colonel. So he's a colonel in the ROK Army, a subordinate to General Choi. He is the person that Dr. Ri Sigmund, the first president of Korea, commissioned to not reinvent. They were trying to reinvent. They were trying to reinvigorate and reinstill pride and bring back the culture that was eradicated under the Japanese occupation. This was a program overtly being sponsored by the government to do. So this historian was the one who's credited with coming up with the myth about the Hwarang warriors, and it is largely a myth. But this is the first pattern that General Choi creates. I don't think that's a coincidence.
No.
I don't think that's a coincidence at all. Which is the second, Chung Mu. Who is Chung Mu? Chung Mu is the most revered military officer in the history of Korea. Who is Ulji? Another military general. So you have the admiral by sea, the general by land. These were, and this is not, and then you come up with Samil, March 1st, which just passed, the independence movement in 1919. Then you have Unam, the pen name for Sigmund Rhee, was the way that General Choi sucked up and tried to gain favor to the president because he wanted support. And once that guy was banished, left exile, the American CIA flew him out on a CIA plane to Hawaii, and he lived his last remaining years, I think 8 years in Hawaii, and he died in exile. But when he left in 1960, General Choi, there was a second printing or a second edition of that first book, the 1959 book. And in that second book, 1960, Unam is already taken out. That's why I deemed it the lost or forgotten pattern. Yeah. So you can see that this was very important. The history, the culture, the national pride. So where did General Choi come up with the idea to use these figures to name his patterns after? And it was in the United States. He came here 1949, 1950. They rushed him back home when the all-out fighting of the Korean Civil War started. But he was here. He did 2 training, one in Fort Riley, Kansas, I believe, and one in Fort Central, USA, and one in the East Coast. I don't know, it was Kansas or Oklahoma, but in the Midwest and on the East Coast. And in between the 2 trainings, he had free time. Sightseeing in New York City, you see the Statue of Liberty, you see the Empire State Building, and you see him in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial. He came up with the idea, especially Washington, D.C., our national capital. Everything is named after our patriotic figures. You know, the English, the Scotch, the Welsh, the Irish, the Spaniards, the Italians, the Greeks, the Africans, the Egyptians, the Moroccans, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Okinawans. They all came up naturally based upon language, culture, religion, these traditions. There was no hard borders. The United States came up with what? They were British subjects. The United States was formed on an ideal. You could move to the United States, legally immigrate, become a U.S. citizen. You could be just as American as me. You won't speak American like I do, but as far as everything goes, you'll be just as American as me. The only thing you won't be able to do is run for president. That's all. No difference. No. So I can go to Japan. You can go to Japan. We can both go to Korea, South Korea, North Korea. We could live there. We might. It's very, very hard to get citizenship in those countries and other countries as well. I'm a citizen of the EU. I'm an Irish citizen as well. I can live anywhere in Europe, no problem, right? So in the EU, not in Europe, but in the EU. But so no matter where we went to, if we legally immigrated, there's a provision to become a legal resident, a permanent resident, and then maybe even citizenship. But in no way could I ever become Korean. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
I won't be Korean in the sense of what is a Korean, the essence of a Korean, of a Japanese. I can go to German. I can learn Korean. I can learn German. I can become a German citizen. But will I be a German? Maybe my children would be born and raised in Germany, German culture, whatever. I don't know. But clearly, I can never become a Korean. I can never become an Egyptian. It's just not. I can never become a Nigerian. Why is the Nigerian a Nigerian? It goes back to their traditions in their national units, their tribal customs and whatnot, right? So it's the same thing here. You know, when we look at Korea had to be reborn, so to speak. So the patterns were very, very important. So General Choi had the idea of who he wanted the pattern to be named after, and then assembled moves, and he put them in a sequence. Now, at various times in assembling these sequences, he had people around him. Some, like Nam Tae-hee and Han Cha-kyo, General Choi had it written out on a manuscript. He called them up. He's calling out the movements.
Yeah.
Now, if he's calling out the movements, you think Nam Tae-hee created those movements? He's calling them out. Now he comes here, he says, you call them out here. Now, you know how I know that Han Cha-kyo didn't make Chung-mu? His students think they did. Because Han Cha-kyo told the story to Grandmaster Jung Woo-jin. I'm arguing with General Choi. When you do the flying side kick, you know, like we step left, jump off that left foot, and then kick with the right foot. He was trying to say, no, step left, jump right, jump off the right foot, kick with the right, which is the way you would do a flying kick. Mm-hmm. He's telling General Choi, no, you got to do it this way. So who do you think made Chung-mu? Han Cha-kyo or General Choi? So every single pioneer that I've interviewed that had anything to do with the patterns, including you mentioned Hyo Cho. Hyo Cho's instructor, Cho Sang-ming. He was back in Korea when they were doing, he took over teaching the international instructor course when J.C. Kim went to Malaysia, dispatched abroad. And he tells me, General Choi had the manuscript. J.C. Kim, the same thing. They all say the same thing. Nam Tae-hee told Alex Gillis, he told Grandmaster Earl Weiss. This is before Alex Gillis did his phenomenal book. Yeah. This was all out that Nam Tae-hee said, I was the actor, he was the director. He had the script and he was telling us what to do. We gave feedback, which a good director, like Clint Eastwood is one of my favorite directors. And he says he shoots 1 or 2 takes, that's it. Yep. And a lot of the times the actor will say, that didn't feel right. Can we shoot this again? He goes, and they say, Clint Eastwood say, it looked fine to me, but you want to go at it again? Let's do it. So a good director is going to solicit feedback. So there's no question that there were people that, and they told General Choi, no, General Choi, this doesn't flow. And they made adjustments. Now, making adjustments, does that mean you are a co-creator? Maybe. That's subjective. Yeah. If so, for instance, what is Gaebaek? Gaebaek is 44 movements. Yep. So Gaebaek 44 movements. This is done with Grandmaster Choi Chang-kyun, CK Choi. Yep. He tells me the story. They're in Nansan. Nansan is where the Army Recruit Training Center is. CK Choi gets permission from his parents to join the military, and General Woo Jung Lim, which is his teacher, was a subordinate to General Choi. He was at time charge of, he opened the first Otakwan civilian school where CK Choi and Grandmaster Kong Young-il were training at. So he's their instructor. He went to the house and said, don't worry, we're under General Choi. We're going to get him a cushion assignment. He won't be up at the front. He won't be at the DMZ. You know, he probably, and these guys told me, they wore their Taekwondo uniform, their dobak, much more than their military uniform or the military fatigues, you know? And that's what they did. Park Chung-soo told me he used to wear his military uniform quite often because he was in the color guard. So at all the parades and things, he'd have to get dressed up to hold the flag. So C.K. Choi tells a story about Gaebek. They're in Nansan. What happened in Nansan? What is this area? The Army Recruit Training Center is there. So years after he told me the story, I'm driving around in Nansan with Dr. Zibby Crook and CJO from the Taekwondo Tool Tour. And I see Nansan, and we're driving, and I see Gaebek Road, R-O. That means like Gaebek Road or street or something like that. And I said, oh my God, Gaebek. And I said, oh yeah, this is the area he was from. Now, I don't know if they knew that's where General Choi was in the early 60s when he was in charge. He was in charge of the Recruit Training Center.
Yep.
And that's where C.K. Choi was assigned, and he worked with him on Gaebek. And we know that because this account is well documented. And he told me, no, General Choi had the movements already, and he had the name already, and he had that it was done on the, the pattern diagram is a straight line, a vertical line, and that's to indicate General Gaebek's strict military discipline. Like he didn't deviate from his mission. So General Choi had all that in mind when he's telling him do these things. And C.K. Choi would tell him. Kang Young-il told me the same thing. Cho Sang-ming, who was doing, he taught Hyo Cho and Park Chung-tae. They were in that same international instructor course. And by the way, Hyo Cho, because he graduated so high up, he got dispatched to India. Yep. He's the pioneer of Taekwondo in India. And today he's not given credit by people in India. But he is the person. Him and another one, his name escapes me. The other one was actually the senior, so he probably might deserve more credit, but he seemed to have faded into obscurity in Taekwondo history. As Kim Buk-man and Woo Jae Lim, what happened to Woo Jae Lim? Kim Buk-man became this really thriving figure that had a huge following, created his own group, his own martial art and whatnot. So Hyo Cho, instructor, told me about like the last 4 patterns that are in the 72 book. He was very instrumental in helping with them. Han Cha-kyo with Tong-il, Nam Tae with Warang, and Han Cha-kyo with Warang, and Han Cha-kyo with Chung-mu, Han Cha-kyo with Ul-ji. These are all documented where they were. Now, you said the 20 patterns. It wasn't originally 20 patterns. Originally, it was 2.
Of course.
Warang and Chung-mu, right? And then they just, now, how do we come up with original or 20 or whatever? So the first book is 1959, and it has 5 patterns in it. So we can say those are the original 5 patterns, right? Yeah. Because they appear in documented form somewhere. Then we come up with the 1965 book with the 20 patterns. So people think, oh, the original 20 patterns. No. 24 patterns were done. They simply ran out of time to complete the book because they were going on the Kooky Goodwill tour around the world, government sponsored, and they needed to print the books. So the layout, didn't have computers and all that stuff, and everything was done by typesetting and photographic frames, and very tedious. The footprint diagrams and whatnot. So they simply ran out of time. So in Malaysia, because of the 65 book, I credit Grandmaster Kim Buk-man and Woo Jae Lim in assisting with 15, 16 of those patterns, because we know Tong-il was done before that. And why do we know that? Because Han Cha-kyo was helping with that, and Han Cha-kyo wasn't in Malaysia. We know Gaebek was done before that because Gaebek was done in Nansan before General Choi went to Malaysia. Yeah. So I kind of came up with the thing that, well, we need to credit 2 people with those 16 patterns, because we know they were there definitively, that they were there assisting him. And Kim Buk-man told me in the room, they actually first got off the boat, and they arrive in Malaysia. They're living in General Choi's residence, the official ambassador's residence, in a room. They shared a room. I don't know if they had mattresses on the floor or twin beds, but they were in this room. And on the room, they would have pinned up on the walls, A, B, C, D, you know, the facing the diagram. And they had General Choi's manuscript. And they would work through these patterns. Now, I do know if you look at the patterns, all of the early patterns are not symmetrical.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
From Chunji and those that came afterwards, they're all symmetrical. And I believe Grandmaster Kim Bok-man insisted upon that with General Choi. And he obviously was successful. And I believe him because there's no reason not to believe him. And there's an indication, well, the ones that General Choi created that didn't have him there are not symmetrical.
Yep.
So this somehow was a major influence. And Kim Bok-man was there living with General Choi, and then they eventually were living in the dojang. They got their own apartments and whatnot, but eventually they were outside of the governor's residence, the ambassador's residence, and had their own places, whether it was in the dojang or their own apartment. But they were very close with General Choi, and Malaysia and Singapore grew like wildfire. That's when General Choi asked for Riki Ha and CK Choi to come, and because it really was going wild. So there's no question that Nam Tae-hee, Han Cha-kyo, Kim Bok-man, Woo Jae-lim, and see, one of the things I like to make clear about Malaysia, we emphasize Kim Bok-man, but Lieutenant Woo Jae-lim was there with Sergeant Kim Bok-man. So you must equally credit Woo Jae-lim because they were partners. They were very, very close. Now, I don't know who contributed more. I do know that Grandmaster Kim Bok-man was this phenomenal martial artist that has a world following that's still very active today in his 80s. Yeah. So there's no doubt in my common sense thinking that he was highly instrumental. Also, knowing Grandmaster Kim, he's very vocal. He's not afraid to challenge anybody, including General Choi. Yep. And he, along with Grandmaster J.C. Kim, you know, these people that challenged General Choi, they were always getting fired and rehired, you know? But, you know, that's kind of like the sign of a bad general keeps firing people, but a sign of a good general, oh, I value the input, let me get them back, you know? You know, I always want people to tell me when I'm wrong, because when I'm wrong, I can adjust my findings, or I can say, I never thought of that, but now I think of it, you're actually wrong. So I like that pushback and that feedback. So now General Choi leaves, his diplomatic assignment is over in Malaysia, goes back to Seoul as ambassador at large, becomes the KTA president, changes the name from Taekwondo to Taekwondo, puts this book together. And one of the ways he won the vote by one margin is because he said, listen, I'm the president of the Korean Taekwondo Association. I'm going on the Kuki Taekwondo government-sponsored Goodwill Tour. I just had Taekwondo proclaimed the national martial art of Korea. And I have this book saying Taekwondo, the Korean martial art of self-defense. How can I go abroad as president of the Taekwondo Association? I can't hand out the book with Taekwondo and my business card with Taekwondo. So he was very forceful. He's very determined. He's a very driven person. And in whatever lobbying he did to form coalitions, he won by one vote. And that's how it became Taekwondo. And so now he's out of the KTA and is in the ITF. And now he says, oh, I have to make the definitive book on Taekwondo. And that's what it was called. It was even advertised in the magazines, the Bible of Taekwondo. I have old magazines that actually have that advertisement in it. So the book was 500 something pages. And up until that time, it was unprecedented, superseded by the encyclopedia. But now it's got 24 patterns in it. Why? Well, he had time to finalize the layout for the actual printing of the book so it could be published with 24 patterns. So it wasn't like the original 20. They just got in the book. So that's the chronological order of documenting. But before the 72 book comes out, you have the official ITF training film that has all 24 patterns in it. And that I date around 1968 because your mentor, Grandmaster Hio Cho, was a student of Grandmaster Cho Sang-ming, who eventually went to Brazil as the pioneer there. He was the instructor. And these are the ones that are doing this film. And it has all 24 patterns. So we know he was there. And what is he doing? Him, along with Kim Young-soo, who was the chief instructor after he left, they're all working out these movements for the book and whatnot. So there was so much feedback. And we do know that Tongil was changed. The way the directions are in the 65 book are different from the directions in the 72 book. And, patterns were not revised, refined. Movements were refined. Like things weren't taken out. Like there was no in Yugo, people think you punch in the beginning, it was with tension. No, that's the way people were taught, but that was never the way it was. Officially, they never said punch with tension. It was just, you're just, extending that hand out there. And General Choi would refine it later on to just, placing up like this. So maybe you went like that in the old days. Yep. There was a big controversy about Kiap. There were never any Kiaps in General Choi's patterns. Never. I cannot find any documentation to it. Now, there are in Jun Ri's books and Hio Cho's books. Yep. But that was something that people added in. Yep. General Choi never had them in and never took them out. So maybe his instructors added it at the end. When I was taught the patterns, we finished, we did them very karate-like, and we finished them with a very strong Kiap. Yep. And I remember being at a seminar with the general, and he called up somebody, and you could tell by the uniform he was not an ITF guy. Yep. So he called him up to do Chunji, and the guy did Chunji. It wasn't bad. He was doing it the way his teacher was taught, but obviously not to General Choi's standard. Yep. So he proceeds to pick him apart. Before he picks him apart, he said to him, "Why are you screaming end?" And the guy said, "Oh, that's a Kiap." He said, "Why screaming?" "Oh, it's for the killer blow." So General Choi, without missing a beat, said, "Why you wait 19 movements, killer blow? You're not tired? Why not killer blow first movement?" And that was General Choi's theory. Concept comes from karate, right? One blow, right? We're going to take the appropriate attacking tool, the correct attacking tool, and hit the appropriate vital spot on the body to do most damage. Like, I wouldn't punch you in the eye. I would poke you in the eye. Because if I used my finger to poke you, I could damage the eye. If I punch, maybe I can, I'm not really going to get at the eye. I could do severe damage to the eye socket and the bones up there, no question. But specifically, I want to attack your eye. I want to poke with my fingers at your eye. Yeah. It's the same thing with other areas of the body. You're looking to say, scientifically, what makes sense to attack that way? What angle am I at? Where's the facing? All that stuff. So to me, the answer is General Choi created the patterns. He had them reduced to a manuscript. Even in Malaysia, Lieutenant Wu J. Lim and Sergeant Kim Bak Man, these retired military guys, had the manuscript, were working from it. And Grandmaster Kim has a really, really sharp mind, because he would say when General Choi was back in Korea working on something in the book, he would call Kim Bak Man, and Kim Bak Man wouldn't even need the page. He had this stuff in his head. So, he's a very, very sharp guy. So he was intimately involved. So now, who created these patterns? General Choi and Kim Bak Man, or Kim Bak Man? To me, General Choi created them, and Kim Bak Man had influence. Mm-hmm. And he seems to have a great deal more influence of some other people. But it is a misnomer. It's a falsehood. ITF detractors, especially from the South Korean side, label General Choi. He's not a martial artist. He's a political man. No, Kim Won-young was not a martial artist. He was a political man. General Choi was a martial artist in every sense of the word. He might not have had the physical stature and like a Riki Ha or a Park Jung-soo, Nam Tae-hee, people called the Superman. Young-gu, Lee Chung-woo from the WGF side. These were supermen, and they were. I interviewed Lee Chung-woo, and I met Young-gu, met him in his office when he was Kukiwon president. We talked about many things, but their following tries to make General Choi look like he was not a martial artist. Yeah. That the martial artists he used were the martial artists, and they did it, and General Choi just put it in book form, and he became famous. It's not true. We know it's not true because the supermen that General Choi used all say it wasn't true. Yeah. C.K. Choi says, without a doubt, General Choi is the founder of Taekwondo. Without a doubt. He says he's the founder of Taekwondo. There's no question. He was there, and now you fast forward, you get a guy like Park Chung-tae. Park Chung-tae was instrumental when they created Juche. But Juche was General Choi's vision. And Juche incorporates many movements from Kodang. Kodang was taken out, replaced by Juche. Yep. So General Choi added these very, very difficult movements and kept a lot of Kodang in there. Mm-hmm. So even that's a slight against Kim Il-sung and North Korea. And we know this because General Choi did this before. Unam is taken out, and many of the moves from Unam are incorporated in Chungjang. So Juche, there's two reasons why Kodang was problematic. Kodang was problematic because Kodang Choman-sik was the actual leader, the de facto first leader of North Korea. Yep. And he didn't last long. He was replaced. There was like a commission they put in, and then he was moved off the commission. When the Soviets knew that Kim Il-sung was their go-to guy, he moved to the forefront and became the de facto leader under the Soviet influence. So we know Kodang was killed when the UN forces came north, and he was a political prisoner. They wanted to execute all these political prisoners because they knew they had to abandon Pyongyang and head to the very, very north of the country to hide in the mountainous region. They didn't want an infrastructure to be put in place to replace their structure. Yep. And the dissidents that were held would be that team to be the apparatus to take over. So they executed those people. We know that from the study of history. A colleague of mine that I've met through the National Committee in North Korea and attended many of his lectures, his doctoral dissertation was going through the Soviet files in the Russian language that were released and declassified after the Soviet Union collapsed. And his specialty, he works for the Woodrow Wilson Institute. His specialty is the Soviet files with respect to North Korea. So this is why we're able to gain so much insight to what's going on behind the scenes. But General Choi, the way the story goes, General Choi, Kim Il-sung wanted a pattern named after him. And General Choi lied to him. Oh, we can't make a pattern after a living person. All of our figures are all dead. But he lied. Why? He already did it with Unam. Yeah. And then he removed that. Nobody knew about that. So that's where they came up with making a new pattern, Juche. So the Juche is this ideology from North Korea where man is in control of their own destiny. Like their future is in their hands. Yeah. And that's the sanitized version for Taekwondo's purposes. Mm-hmm. It's actually much deeper in the North Korean ideology, the state ideology. But the pattern definition, that's it in a nutshell. It's like saying the power of the individual. Like, you want to do something, you can do it, go do it. Your future's in your hands. You control your destiny. So it's an uplifting martial arts theme, but it pales in comparison to what the ideology is in the North. Basically it's like self-reliance. We're sealed off from the world. We don't need anybody. We don't have to involve ourselves in the international community and so on. So So Choi was put in, and now General Choi wanted to keep the theme of 24. So Kodan, being the junior patriot, he's the youngest one. The junior patriot is taken out, which makes sense. And General Choi told me this when I asked him. And also, where is Kodan? It's the second degree level. So what is a first degree black belt? You learn the basics. What is a second degree black belt? A second degree black belt is a black belt who's got the basics down pat, that's trained for an additional period of time to now move to this level. And in theory, you're still young and energetic and talented. Your physical capabilities have not started to decline. So this is the optimum point in your training to put in the most difficult pattern. So that's how that came about. So for many, many years, people thought Park Chung-tae created this pattern. And yes, Park Chung-tae was General Choi's right-hand man, had significant input. But when you speak to the North Koreans that were there when this pattern was being, because they trained Kodang early on. They were training Kodang so it wasn't like Kodang had to be taken out. It was more, we're going to support the government. And just like General Choi was getting support from the government in South Korea, it's a trade-off. And a controversial trade-off, I get it. So some people still use Kodang. I have taught it to my students. I never learned it, but I learned it on my own afterwards. I've taught it to some of my students. And obviously I never learned Unam. Never was taught Unam, but I learned it and have taught that to some of my students. And I think it's great. I'll go do a seminar on history, and then in the middle of the seminar, I'll tell everybody up to get up on the floor. Let's do Unam, and we'll recreate it and we'll go back into time. I'll assign somebody to be General Choi. Sit down here, call out the instructions, and we'll start off by saluting, no bowing, because that's what they did. So, these are wonderful things you can incorporate into even boring lectures where somebody's just going on and on, So yeah, but that's really. So I like to credit people that we know played a hand in assisting, and how much the assistance and feedback and input is going to vary. But the person, the creative genius that designed these patterns is General Choi. There's no question. And different pioneers, different students and followers at various points in time gave feedback, and was incorporated as General Choice saw fit. It was him that produced the final product. So the process along the way, I think, is very important to identify and credit. And really, that's my fault, because when I was working with Master Stuart Ansel, a really great guy from the UK, on his book, From Creation to Unification, we identified some of those people, but that somehow they forget the disclaimer that these were people we've identified that helped. That doesn't mean they created them. It doesn't mean there weren't others. See, I'm all about adding, but don't take that book, which is great, and say because George Vitale listed these people. No, because I say in there, this is incomplete, and we need to learn more, and we need to credit more people. So that's a big problem, but it's something that should, that book is great because it expands on all these pattern histories, but General Choi created the patterns, and various of his followers and students had differing levels of feedback and input, and had various levels of influence.
Dr. Vitale, we're just shy of 3 hours.
Sure. Okay.
Which is unbelievable. And in many ways I think we've just scratched the surface.
Sure.
Please, I would love to have you back on.
No problem. Anytime.
Sometime in the near future. But I've said a couple of times on the podcast so far that I've been like a kid in a sweet shop, just so excited by who it is I'm speaking to. But honestly, Dr. Vitale, I cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing just the knowledge that you have, sir. Just seems to be incomparable. I really can't thank you for coming on and sharing.
No, you don't have to thank me. It's really me that has to thank you, because you give me an opportunity to get the knowledge that was so gracefully shared with me to be shared with others. So I salute your efforts. I'm happy to come back and talk about any aspect that I can. Not a problem. As you know, I've been traveling since November.
Yes.
I should be back home somewhere in April. But I will get busy. Come this weekend, I'll get busy again. But I'm always available. And as I said, since I'm traveling, I don't really have any of my books and notes to refer to, but most of the stuff is cemented into my little pea brain. I guess that's why I have no hair, because it just burnt off with all that the brain power going all the time. But yeah, it's not a problem. I'm glad to speak freely and openly about anything that I can possibly speak about. When there are items that would be inappropriate for me to comment on in a public setting like this, I would respectively decline and state the reasons why. And I am also not afraid, not embarrassed to say I don't know the answer, or we don't know, we're still digging for that. And the way I always like to sign off and end these things is not only by thanking you and the host and whatever of listeners that will listen in, but I'm going to ask both yourself and any listeners, if there's anything I got wrong that needs to be adjusted, that needs to be corrected, needs to be fine-tuned, please let me know, because my sole focus, my only goal is to present more truth of Taekwondo's history. And in doing that, I hope to credit people who have been ignored. And along that line, I want to rehabilitate General Choi's image. He really is a great Korean patriot, a true Korean national. He loved his country. He wanted to see it united again, peacefully, under democratic rule. And he used his Taekwondo to promote that honorable goal. So I'm always wanting to gain additional information. So it's not only I might have missed something, might have gotten something wrong, or not relayed it correctly, or it needs fine tuning, but there's things I don't know. And we need to get these things out there. We need to get them tested, right? We need to get these ideas have to be floated, and people have to push back on them. So we fine tune them, and because so much of what we have come to know is misleading at best, and then we make conjecture from this misleading information. Sometimes the misleading information is done on purpose. So we need to eradicate that. Kim Un-young was not a bad man. I know he ran into problems legally in Korea, but without him, there's no Taekwondo in the Olympics. That's just true. It's so self-evident if we take the time to examine that. And without General Choi, there's no Taekwondo. Doesn't mean there wouldn't be a Korean martial art that's popular around the world, and it doesn't mean the Koreans wouldn't have put a sport version of that in the Olympics. But it wouldn't be Taekwondo. So without Taekwondo, without General Choi, there's no Taekwondo. He's the principal founder of the original Taekwondo. And I'm very happy that today people in Korea are realizing that his influence was profound, and they're coming to appreciate how much he loved his country. The Korean pioneers, some never knew General Choi, when they hear that he gave up his own family for Taekwondo, they say, wow, this man really lived for Taekwondo, because there's not many people that would do that. And some people would badmouth him for doing that, and I can understand that if I was in the family, but that is a testament of how much he loved Taekwondo. He would live, breathe, and sleep Taekwondo. Everything was Taekwondo to him. So I'm very happy that South Korea has recognized him. They've credited him in the Taekwondo Won, and he's openly talked about. So it's all because of efforts for people like you, because this information, like I say, we uncover it. If it doesn't get out there, it doesn't have impact. So I'm very willing to do, and I implore any of the listeners to this podcast to please give yourself some feedback and get it to me, because these things have to be put into the big picture.